Hello, this is Randy with Excel for Freelancers, and welcome to the Dynamic Invoice Designer. In this week's training, I'm going to show you how to create one of the best invoices I have ever designed in Excel. Fully customizable, fully dynamic. This incredible template includes one-click toggle edit mode, one-click show and hide fields, one-click show and hide columns, one-click add and edit customers, one-click date picker pop-up, multi-page support with invoice pagination, dynamic terms with automated due date, and a whole lot more. I cannot wait, so let's get started. All right, thanks so much for joining me. I've got a really incredible training. Now, we've done invoices before, but nothing like this. This fully dynamic invoice, we can use multiple pages. So that means that our invoices here can have multiple pages. Page 1 of 3, we can then loop through the pages of a single invoices and of course, print all of those pages. We're going to show you that. We'll be able to add new customers, create or edit customers through this little pop-up. We're going to be able to edit these invoices. So if we want to edit some of the invoice details, maybe we want to hide some of the invoice details or show them, we can do that here. So if we want to make changes to anything, we can do that here. We want to make a change to the label. All we need to do is just change it here, and it's going to automatically change up here. So we've got that to show you. If I want to hide or show columns, if I don't want a date column on my invoices, maybe I don't want a tax column, I just unselect here and it's going to automatically adjust the width, and you may just have to move a few things over if you want, but it's very, very dynamic. Quickly and easily create customizable invoices all automatically and very easy with just a few clicks. We can turn off this edit mode and then all those features available are gone through conditional formatting. I'm going to show you how to do that. We have a dynamic footer message. Now this footer message is going to be at the bottom of here. We notice we show you what page that we're on. We've got the footer message at the bottom, total, subtotal, and tax and invoice, and everything is in there automatically. We will be able to navigate through additional invoices if we have, or we can also enter an invoice number here and it's automatically going to go to that invoices. We can use previous and next. If we're at the last, it's going to tell us. And if we're at the beginning, it's also going to tell us whether we're on the first one. So we can do that. So there's so many features in this invoice. So I'm going to take you through every single step of it. So you're going to be able to create your own invoices on completion of this. And you're going to know all about formulas. We're going to learn about functions. We're going to learn about shapes. We're going to learn about conditional formatting, VBA behind it. We're going to use everything. So not only will you be able to create amazing invoices, you're going to be able to learn the foundation of VBA beyond this. So I'm going to take you through every step. Also, if we want to add a new page, all we need to do is click Add Page. It's going to add a brand new page where we'll be able to add different items to that brand new page of the invoice. So a lot of things. Let me just save that now. You see this is page 4 of 4. So we got page 3, page 2, page 1. So pagination is a great something to add to those invoices, something that we have not had before. We've always been limited to one, and we also did do a multi-page, but it went all the way down here. So I think this is a much better. So we have a very fixed, very specific field that we can set. That range is going to be set to just that, and then we can just open it. So it's a really nice idea, and I'm going to show you how you can do that. And you can use this for any type, whether it's proposals, estimates, bids, invoices. You're going to be able to apply this to any type of form. So I'll show you all of the ins and outs of how that is done. All right, so let's get into it right now. The first thing that I want to show you is this customization field. So within this particular edit mode, once it's turned on, we can edit the invoice details. So we have all the items of an invoices that we may want to include or exclude on an invoices. If we don't want page number, let's say page number is down here. If I don't want that, I'm going to unselect it. It's now going to be gone. Notice it is gone. So, and also if I want to add a label, I could. Notice that invoice total is, and I've got to extend that a little bit. Invoice, it says invoice. I want to make sure that that's invoice total. It is grouped. So maybe I want to extend that a little bit, make sure that the width is about 1.3. So we can do that. And I'll just bring this over. So we see that now we can add this into this invoice total. It's overlapping now. But as I bring this out, You see that we've got invoice total here already set. So this is the total tax. So we've got a lot of flexibility with shapes that we can add into that very, very handily. So we can show or hide the invoice totals. Maybe if we don't want tax, we can unselect the total tax. And you see how now that's going to be, we have a subtotal and we have an invoice total, but we do not have a tax. So very quickly, we can customize this type of an invoice very, very easily. All right, so showing hide, if we want to decide I want to change the label, maybe I just want to put tax on that. I don't want to put total tax. All I need to do is just change it, and then it's just going to say tax. And then, of course, I got to select it to display it, and then that tax is displayed. So it's very, very easy to do that. So we've got all of the information here. So we can show or hide company logo. All these are the invoice details here. Changing the labels here, or whether we want to show or hide. So notice we've got status here is billed. If I decide I don't want to hide it, I don't want to show it, I can just select here, and it is hidden automatically on single selection. So we've got here this 4-tab horizontal tab. So we've got actually a vertical tab here showing the 4 vertical tabs. So this information, we're using the same cells. Notice the columns are not changing, the rows are not changing, so we're using the same cells. So we also want to show or hide company details. Notice we have company, we have all of our company information, but we don't have labels here, which is fine. We don't want a label. But if I decide I do not want to show a logo, I can unclick this. It's going to hide that logo. If I want to display the logo, it's going to show here. Of course, and then the company email, so same thing with every field. We have customer details. Now notice I've got a label here that says customer. Maybe I want to change that to client. I can do so just like that. And it's going to automatically change to client here. If I decide I want to show the phone number, or I want to show the email or hide the email, I can do that through here. So showing and hiding it simply upon selection. And then with the same thing for columns. So we may want to show or hide individual columns. If we want to show that tax column, we can. Also notice how the width of this, the width of the entire invoice here does not change. So it's automatically adjusted here based on that. And that's really a nice feature because we know that we don't have to change our print settings when we're adding and removing columns. So it's going to be very helpful to do that. So if maybe I do not want to have a quantity, I can just unclick here and the width of that invoice stays the same. It's really going to be helpful for print. I'm going to show you how we did that. All right, so we have all of this customized invoice. We have it encompassed in this little toggle button here. Pretty easy. I'll show you how we do that. Okay, the rest of the workbook, relatively simple. Inside the admin, we've got a few settings. I've got our company information. So when we change this company information, it is automatically linked to this invoice. So here it says Fredder's Service. If I were to change this to Fredder's Construction or something, say hamburgers, and then we can see that it's automatically going to be changed on the invoice. So it's automatically linked, which is nice. So simply changing that inside the admin company information can do that. So we'll change back to Fredder's Service. As our logo, we got an address. So all of these fields are linked to the invoice, including email logo, including this logo. We've got a little browse for logo. It's going to let us to browse for any logo we want just here. So it'll put the file path of that entire logo right here in the cell. So we know it knows where to look it up. We've got an invoice status. So these are all the statuses that are set. When we have invoices, we can then change the status based on that drop down list. So based on that, we've got a named range called status that's going to be covered there. So we also want to default open. And what does that mean? That means when I select a brand new invoice, it is that status that's going to be set. If I were to change that status to unpaid, wanted to do new invoices, it is that status that's going to be changed there. So automatically that default. And it's the same thing for terms. Notice the term says net 30 on new invoices. If I were to change it to net 15 and click here, we could see when we create a brand new invoice, that's going to be changed to net 15. That due date here, 1/13, is automatically based on the status, which is, the terms, which is net 15, and the due date. So that means if I were to change that to, let's say, the 31st, that due date would automatically update. Also, if I were to change that, the terms here to net 30, that due date would also automatically update. I'll show you how to do that. So those terms going to come directly from the admin. So we have the term name, and then we have the number of days that we're going to be adding. So we add that to the invoice date to get the due date. We also want to set the default on that. So we could do that. All right, we've got some invoice options and details. This we actually don't need. I've created this. This is kind of just a summary of all the invoice options and details. It's more of informational, and I'll show you. I've spread that out just to show you what invoices are options. We've got footer messages. As you saw here inside the invoice, we can change the message that's going to appear at the bottom. There's no footer message that's selected here. However, as soon as I select a footer message here, we can see that it's going to appear here. So that's automatically linked, that footer message. So we can change that any way we want. So we've got a list of those coming directly from there. I've got invoicing tax, whether we're charging tax or not. If that changes to no, when we go back to the invoice, it's automatically, there's going to be no sales tax. So if let's go to the previous here, and we can see that now there's no tax calculations on here because it's automatically calculated based on the tax. If I were to change the tax rate, so would the calculations. That's it for the admin screen. Okay, so all long as we've got a list of invoices, every invoice is stored here. The invoice ID, the date, the customer, the term, status, due date, footer message, total, and the total number of pages. Very important for our pagination. The total number of pages. Invoice number 1 has 4 pages. Invoice number 5 has 2 pages, and the rest have 1. I also want to know what items are associated. Now we see we've got in this invoice number 5 here, we've got 2 pages. On page 1, we have these 5 items, and on page 2, we have 6 items. We see that this invoice has 2 different pages. So we also want to keep track of all that, and we want to know which items on which pages. So that's going to be stored inside invoice items. So this table is going to handle that. First thing we have is the invoice ID. We have the page number. I want to know what page is stored on. If there's a date, the item name, the description, the quantity, the amount total, whether it's taxed or not. Invoice row. Now this is the associated row on the invoice, 10, 12, 11. What does that mean? That means this row here. Notice this is row 10, 11, 12, and so on and so forth. So I want to know what row is stored. If I put a brand new item on here, I need to know that it's on row 15, and that way as soon as I save that and I go back to the previous page, or let's say go to the next page and then back, I need to make sure that we come back on the correct, we need to make sure that this comes back to the correct row that we originally saved it on. So that's very important. We need to know what row, and therefore we're saving that row. I also need to know what database row. This is the current row it's on. Notice this is 4, 5, and 6. And this is just populated with a formula row. Okay, when I do run an advanced filter, when I need to know all the items on a specific page, I want to know all the items on a very specific page for a invoice ID, right? So we need to run an advanced filter to do that. For example, on invoice ID number 5, on page number 1, these are the items that are going to appear. So we're going to do an advanced filter. And this is our criteria, both invoice ID and page 1. So we need to have both of these because not only do I need to know what invoice, I need to know what page they lay on, and that's going to tell us what page. So we can then load these items in. As we loop through different pages, this will change, and I'll show you that right now. I've also got a list of customers here, basically customer information, ID, name, address, so on and so forth. And we have also some items. So this is our items. When we pull those items up, when I create brand new invoices, those items need to come from somewhere, and the information associated along with the quantity, the default amount, that is going to come from here. So we have the default quantity, the price, and whether it's taxable or not. This calendar pop-up is just simply for the calendar that we're using. We will not be going into this. This is a backup shape in case the one gets deleted. This one will be automatically replaced in there. So that's pretty much a good summary of what we got going on here. So let's go into some of the VBA and see exactly how this is going to work so that we can associate that, walk you step by step through everything so you're not going to miss anything. Feel free to, of course, replay these videos, watch them again, slow the speed down if I'm moving too fast. I do appreciate your feedback. Make sure you leave a comment below, like this video, give it a thumbs up. That'll help me out. I appreciate that. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Why don't we focus on some of the basic selection changes? In other words, when I make a selection change or a worksheet change, something happens. A selection change is this. When I make that change, I want something to happen. So let's take a look inside the code. We're going to go over some of the changes that happen on this sheet. When I make changes to the sheet, I want things to happen. So we're going to go item by item and see how it works. We're going to go into Developer, Visual Basic, Alt F11 will get you there. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on this invoice. I'm going to go to this sheet, Invoice. This is where everything's happening. And we're going to start up at the top and work our way all the way down in order so that it makes it easier for you. We're going to dimension the item type row. When I have a specific item type, I need to know what row it's on, and I'll go over that. Item column, item row is long, and the term row as long. Term row, I need to know what row that term's on. So we're going to need to know, obviously, if we set a default, I need to know what the status row is, what the term row is. So we've got those rows where the default is. So that's why those two are important. Okay, the first thing we want to do is this is going to be on worksheet change. When I make a change to a worksheet, I want something to happen. What kind of change are we going to be focused on here? First of all, I wanted to mention the item database row is long, the inventory item row or invoice item row, and also the selected row. And if the user makes a change to more than one cell at one time, we're going to exit the sub. We're only focused on a single. Sometimes if we have a merge cell, we might need to increase this. Okay, on invoice search, what does that mean? If on invoice search, this particular cell, F2, here's what I want to happen. When I put in an invoice number here, I want that invoice to load up. If they put in an incorrect number, I want to let them know, please select a correct invoice. So that's the first thing. That is a change event. When the user makes a change to F2 and the change is not nothing, means there's not blank, then I want something to happen. So here's what it's going to be. If not intersection target, the range is F2. When they make a change to F2, and I also want to make sure that F2 is not empty. As long as those two conditions are true, I want something to happen. First of all, I want to make sure to see if B2 is true. Now let's go ahead and go over some of the hidden columns so we can understand things. It's only a few things here. I want to know when the invoice is loading. What does that mean by invoice loading? As soon as I load an invoice, this is going to go to true and it's going to go back to false. And I'll explain that a little bit later on. But basically, when changes happen here, notice if I'm changing something here, that's one type of a change. The user made a change and I want to load the information up. Another type of a change is when VBA loads it. If I hit enter 2 here, that's another type of a change. I don't want to automate load. I want to load what's coming from the database. What's coming from invoice items here, what was saved, not necessarily the item information here. So there's two different types of changes. I need to differentiate those two types of changes by this, and we'll go over that here. The search row, now this is the row. I've got some named ranges, so this is going to help us out here. If the user makes a change here, I want to look up what number was found. If that invoice was found, then I want to load it up. So how do I do that? Well, I can use a named range. So inside our invoice list here, I've got a named range for the invoice ID, and it's called invoice_ID. If we look in the formulas name manager, we're going to see our name manager. I've got a few names. We'll be going over this. This one's called invoice ID. Of course, it's an offset formula, and it's going to encompass all the invoice IDs. So that will have, I've also have a few others. So that's the one I want to focus on now. So what I want to do is if the user puts in invoice number 1, I want to return row number 3. I want to know what row that is on. So to do that, I need to run a match. So we're going to match whatever the user has put in F2. And we're going to look it up in invoice ID, and I'm going to add 2. And the reason I'm adding 2 is because it starts on row 3. So to do that, it's very important. We're going to wrap it on if error. If it's not found, I want to return blank. I don't want an error in this cell. That way I can test. If it's blank, that means the user has entered an incorrect number, and I can let the user know. So that's the first thing we're going to do. If B2 equals empty, this is an incorrect invoice number. Let the user know with the message box, please select a correct invoice number. We're going to exit the sub. So this is when they've entered an incorrect invoice number. So I'm going to type that in here in a comment, incorrect invoice number. Okay, but what if they have a correct invoice number? That means that B2 is not blank. Then what do I want to do? Well, then what I want to do is I want to take whatever invoice number they have entered here, and I'm going to put it directly inside here, B4. B4 keeps track of whatever invoice number has been selected. Notice this particular is it's going to be linked. So I'll show you that, but this is our invoice number. So as I do previous, you'll see that the number changes. As I do next, you'll see that the invoice numbers change. So I want to put that in there. And then what I want to do is I want to calculate the row that's associated with the invoice number here. And as long as this isn't blank, we're good to go. So B4 is going to take on whatever the user has put in F2. I want to clear whatever the user has put in. We're clearing that. That's why this is empty. They've cleared the search. It's a correct invoice number, so we can clear that out. And then we're going to run a macro, which will be going a little bit later, called invoice load. This macro is going to do all the heavy lifting and loading the information inside. So when I enter 1, it is that macro that's going to load all of the information details here, all the items associated here. That's on invoice search. Now we have another one also, as I explained to you, on item change. If I make a change here in column K, I want the item information to load up. So if we were to, let's say, go to the next page here, blank, what do I want to happen? When I select an item from this list, I want to look up the information here inside our items list. I want it found, and I want it to return the description, the default quantity, and the price. And I want to put them directly inside here, the description, the quantity, and the amount. Then the total here is automatically added with a formula. So that's what we're going to do there. If the user makes a change between K10 and K44, and I also want to make sure B1 is false. Very important. That means the type of change that the user has changed. When B1 is true, that means the invoice is loading. Remember that there's a change. If we take a look at here, well, let's go to the next one. If we take a look here, we see that the invoice is loading here. There's nothing on invoice here, so we can pull it up here. This one has that information here. So this type of change is something different. So I want to make sure that we can understand that. Great. So I want to focus on that. Now that we have that, so what do we want to do? First of all, I want to make sure that if B5 is empty, I want to let the user know. It's very important in this type of application. When I have a brand new invoice, if I've tried to enter an item, I want to make sure that the user saves that invoice first. So if they've tried to make a change or adding an item, I want to let them know with a box, please make sure to save the invoice before adding the items. Now, how do we know it's not saved? And the reason is because we've got an invoice number here, 6, but that invoice number does not exist on this list. Notice the last one's 5. So what that's going to do is I've got a formula here that's going to let us know the row. It's the same formula that we used up here, but just for a different area. So basically, it's this match formula. We're looking in B4, which is now 6. We're looking through the invoice IDs. It only goes up to 5. And we're adding 2. If it's found, if it's not found, it's going to create an error. So therefore, we want blank. 6 is not found yet. So I know that this invoice has not been saved yet. So what I want the user to do is save the invoice first. And I want them to put a customer in here. And I want them to then save it. As soon as it's saved, a row is then secured here. Now we see in the invoice list, 6 is saved and it's on row 8. So now I know that we can add the item. I want to prompt them to first save it before we add any items. And the reason that we want to do that is because as soon as I add an item, I want it saved to the database. And that's very important here because I want to make sure that if they're adding that, it gets saved automatically to the database. So notice this bathroom vanity on invoice number 6 on row 10 that automatically got saved. And that's very important. If we look in the invoice items at the last one, we see here the item that I just added, invoice ID number 6, page number 1, bathroom vanity here, it got added in all the way. If I were to add a date, it'd be added right here. If we take a look at this and I decide to add a date, that date's going to automatically be added here. So I want to make sure it's updated. As soon as there's changes, I want to make sure it's updated. So that's how we're going to do it. But I want to make sure that we find that item first. So when they search for that item, I want to make sure if they put in something incorrect and let the user that this is not an incorrect. Okay, so that's important. All right, so if they make a change to K, I want to make sure if B5 is empty, meaning it has not been saved, let's put this invoice not, invoice not saved. Okay, in that case, let the user know with the message box, please make sure to save the invoice before adding the items. I'm going to application enable events. I want to clear the contents of the target. What does that mean? That means I want to clear whatever they've added here. So if I click new invoice and I want to add something, but the invoice has not been saved, I want to 1, give them the message box, and 2, I want to clear this out. Now keep in mind, this is where a lot of people, especially me when I first started out, ran into problems. I would clear the contents of this and it would create a loop and it could crash. Why does that happen? And it happens because of this. Notice target clear contents. This is the change. We're making a change to here. So as soon as this gets cleared out, it's going to re-trigger this and it's going to go back and forth, back and forth. However, if we wrap it in application enable events false and then application enable events true, what happens is this will stop triggering. This change event won't trigger when this is turned off. So that means this type of change won't trigger. Notice because clear contents, this is the trigger between here and here, right? If they make a change to K11, it's going to trigger this again. It's going to loop out and possibly crash your Excel. So this is a great way we can prevent that by turning off application enable events, clearing the contents out and then turning them back on. So that's a very important distinction. I want to make sure to let that know. And then I want to make sure if the targets are empty, right? So what does that mean if they're empty? So now we know that it's been saved. Okay, so first thing what I want to do is if they've made a change, what if that change is empty? Meaning, what if they've deleted it? So if I go to previous, and I decide I'm going to delete this item, what do I want to happen? Well, basically, I want to delete everything that's on here all the way through, and maybe the date too. That's up to you. Okay, so if the target does not equal empty, I want to add the information, and if it's empty, I want to clear it out. So when we add it in, I want to look up this. I want to look it up. When I see bath and vanity, I'm going to look it up inside the items. I want to find out what row it's on. It's on row 4. Then I want to pull the description in column B. I want to pull the quantity in column C. And I want to pull in column D from the price and also that whether it's taxable or not in column E. So we need to pull all that up, but the first thing I do is need to figure out what row it's located on. To do that, we are going to run. So first of all, we know it's not empty. Okay, and on error resume next and on error go to 0. Now the reason is that is because we're going to use the find. And if it's not found, it could create an error. So the first thing is I want to extract that row that it's on. It's in the items database. We're going to look in the item name. I've got a named range for the item name. It's named range here. If we look in the formulas, name manager, item name, we see that it's here. So it's again, we're using the offset. It is the named range for the item name. So I'm going to look inside that named range. I'm going to look, what am I looking for? The target value, meaning whatever the user just entered, whatever item that is. We're going to look in the values and whole, and I want to return the row. Okay, so now I want to check. If it's not found, let the user know, please select a correct item from the drop-down list, exit the sub. So either A, this will trigger, or B, we also have a validation on that one, which will also trigger. So if they enter something incorrect, this validation will also trigger. So that can happen too. So there's a few options that we have. Okay, so we want to make sure that they enter an item that's coming directly from that. We're going to exit the sub out. Okay, great. So if it is correct, then what we want to do is inside that target row, I want to put the description. I want to put that in column L, and it's coming from column B. So it's going, that description is going to come into column L, and it's coming directly from column B. And then C, and then D, and then E are also going to come in the corresponding lines. Going to come into M, N, and P. O already has a total. O has a formula here. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to check if either one of these are blank, this one or this one is blank, then this is going to be blank. Otherwise, we're going to simply multiply it. And that's why if I make a change to here or I make a change to here, it is automatically going to be changed in the formula. Okay, so we're simply going to bring in the default quantity into column M coming from column C. We're going to bring in the price coming into column M directly from column D inside our items database. That's it. That's all we have to do along with the taxable in column B. Once all those items are done. Okay, but however, what if it's empty field? Notice this is here. If we look all the way on the up, this is for non-empty. Let's just put non, and this is for empty. So if it's empty, we want to clear the row. It'll be empty when the user actually presses delete. In that case, I want to clear out everything in the item details, and I want to clear out B. We could probably clear the date too, so may want to do that. All right, so we've done that. And then all we have to do, so that just basically means if it's here, we can clear it out. So that's all it's going to do. Continuing on. So that's all we did on item name change. So that's the events that we want to do on item. Now what I also want to do is not only do I want to populate this information, what else do I want to do? I want to save whatever changes the user have made here. I want to make sure that they get saved inside the invoice items database here. I want to make sure it gets saved directly in here. So how are we going to do that? Well, what we can do is we can look for any type of a change. And I also have a row that's associated here. Now that row's hidden. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to unhide it. I'm going to take a look in here. Inside home, I'm going to go into, notice it has a custom format. I'm going to go into more number formats. And you see it's got 2 semicolons here. When it's 2 semicolons, it will hide any number. If I change that back to general and click OK, what that's going to do is it's going to display the rows number. Now these rows correspond to the rows in the invoice list. Notice they're on 78 and 79, and that way I know what row it has been saved to. Okay, so if we take a look in here, so if I decide I'm going to add an item and or update an item, we know that this bath and vanity cabinet got saved on row 79. So I need to make sure that any type of a change automatically get. Now, what if that change, what if there is no row there? Notice there's no row. Then we need a new one assigned. If I decide to add an item here, I need to assign a new row. If there's one that's already been assigned, then we can simply update the existing. So the first thing, what we want to do on any change of anything in here, I want to check to see if there's a row. If there's no row, we're going to add a new one, which will be the first available row here. If there's an existing row, then we know to update it. And that's going to be on the change event, which is what we're focused on, and anywhere from J10 all the way through P and down. So let's focus on that. On any invoice item detail change saved to the database. So that range here is in a non-intersection J10 through P44, any change that happens then. And I also want to make sure B1's false, not on invoice load. So that means when we run the macro invoice load, this goes to true. So none of this will happen when the invoice is loading. So what do we want to do? The first thing what I want to do inside of variables, I want to take that target row, the row that we've made that change, and I'm going to put it into a variable called selected row or select row. Okay, now what we want to do is, I want to determine whether it's been saved or not. We're going to look in column Q, and I could use selected row here as a variable since we just created it. And we're going to look in that, and I want to see if it's empty. If it's empty, it is a new item. Remember, we're looking here in column Q in that row and seeing if it's empty. If it's empty, we are going to create a brand new item. Now, for the items, what I want to do, just one, I want to add, for new items, I want to add the invoice ID. I want to add the row here, and I want to add the row here. So that's only for new items. So that's exactly what we're going to do. If it's a new invoice item, the first thing I want to do is determine the row. So the first available row is the invoice item row. That's the variable that we're going to use. And it's going to be that first available row in column A and XLUp plus 1. That's the first available row inside that database. Okay, next up, what I want to do is I'm going to do all the things that we do only for new items. In column A, we're going to add the invoice number. That invoice number is located directly inside B4. So we see, if we remember correctly, that's where our invoice number is always located in B4. So I want to add that and put that directly inside column 1. I want to put the page number inside column 2 or B column. And that page number, the selected page number, is going to be right here inside B11. That is the page number. That's what we want to focus on. So that's going to go in the second column. So that's exactly what we're going to do right now. Column A is going to take on whatever's in B4. Column B is going to take on that page number. Also, column J, I want to set the invoice row and set the row formula in J and K. What does that mean? Inside columns J, I want to set the row of the invoice, 10, 12, whatever the row of the invoice. And then I want to set the database row with a formula. Now we're using a formula, and this is important because if a row gets deleted, then we want to make sure that all the other rows beyond that get updated automatically. And using a formula will allow us to do that. Okay, so continuing on. So that's going to set that row formula. I also want to take that brand new row that we just created, that new database row, and I want to put it directly inside here in column Q. Normally it's going to be hidden. So that's how we know it's an existing. Okay, great. So what if it's an existing item? If it's an existing item, all we need to do is extract the row directly from what is in Q10. Everything else here, these two lines of code, are going to be automatically updated regardless of the type of value it is. So here we go. Invoice item cells, the invoice item row is going to be the target value. What does that mean, right? So basically with this line of code, so how do I know that? Well, if I look on here, if I know that this is column, let's take a look. We see that this is column J, is column 10. So if I know the date here was changed on column 10 and I want to place that date directly in column C, column 3, how do I know? Well, I know that the target, the column that we've changed it on, is going to be actually column 3. So that means any change to column 10 gets automatically updated into column 3 because they're all in order. So all we need to do is just put it in the same column minus 7. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. The invoice item row, the target column, meaning the column that we made the change, minus 7 is the correct column we want to place it in. And we're just going to put the target value. So whatever the user changed, and that's really helpful. And that's why in our database, date, item name, description, quantity amount, total, tax, everything is in the same order. So if we take a look here inside our invoice, date, item, description, quantity, amount, total, tax. It's in the exact same order. So having it in that order is really beneficial because it cuts down on a lot of code. The only difference is this total. Now this total is formulated, right? But I really want to put that total inside here. However, there's no change, right? There's no change. We're not making a change. Why are we not making a change? Because it's the formula that takes care of it. So how do I make sure? I want to make sure in a separate line of code to add that formula, to update that total in a separate line, because it's changed by a formula, not by the user. So to do that, inside column H is going to take on whatever's in column O in the selected row. And that just means that whatever's in O is going to be placed directly inside column H. And that's going to update the total. Okay, so that's all we need to do to simply update the items as we make a change on any invoice. There's a few other changes that I want to go over. Again, as you remember here, when we make a change in an invoice, if I make a change to an invoice date or I make a change to a term, I want to make sure that that due date automatically gets updated. So that's going to be a change event on either E4 or a change event on B6. So, E6 or E4. Changes to those cells, I want to automatically update the due date. So let's focus on that. Any term or invoice date change, update the due date, not on invoice load, and only if applicable. Meaning that both E4 and E6 must contain values, right? If one of them is blank, it's not going to be helpful. And we want to make sure it's not on invoice load. We only want that due date calculated when the user manually makes those changes and not when they're making a change or making an update. So that's very, very important because we want them to, whatever's been saved. And that the reason is if they manually make a change to that due date, I want that manual change to be automatically updated when I load this invoice in. So we only want it calculated when a user makes a change to invoice or terms, but not on invoice load. So on a change of either one of those two cells, and E4 does not equal empty. In other words, there has to be an invoice date. And E6, there has to be a term. So both of those must be. And of course, B1 equals false, meaning invoice is not loaded. So when all those things are true, then we can check it out. Now, what I want to do is I want to find the term row. Important thing is I need to know how many days. If net 30, I need to add 30 days to our invoice date to create a due date. Now, where are we going to get the number of those days? And that's going to come directly in here. It's going to be in this column I. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look up that term and I'm going to find out what row it's on. And I'm going to return whatever's in I in that row. I'm going to add that number to the invoice date, and that's going to get us our due date. So we can do that here. Now, anytime we use the find, right, we could create an error. So we always want to wrap it in on error resume next and on error go to 0. I want to do the term row. What row is that term associated on? So we're going to look inside the admin. I'm going to look in that named range called terms. I'm going to look for whatever's in E6. That's the term. I'm going to look in the values and whole, and I'm going to extract the row. Now, if it's been found, it won't be 0. If it is 0, we're simply going to exit the sub. It has not been found. However, if it has been found, what I'm going to do is I'm going to update that due date. That due date is located in E8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the invoice date, which is located in E4, and I'm going to add in what? I'm going to add whatever's in column I, the admin, and the term row. Again, adding whatever's in column I. If it's due on receipt, 0 gets added. So if I change this, notice our due dates. If I change this here to due on receipt, that due date is going to be exactly the same as the invoice date because 0 got added. So that's going to automatically update it. So that's how we do it. Very, very simple, just a few lines of code on that. So next up, we have some changes when we make changes to our customized invoice changes. The following changes are when I make a change to our changes. So notice we do have some changes. These are selection changes, but when I make a change to the labels, I want it, for example, if I want to change this to, let's say it's work date, this is for the column. So if I change this to work date, then I want to make sure that that automatically changes here. Now this is linked to this, something else is actually linked to a separate cell. And why is that? Why can't we just link this to here? Because everything gets cleared out. This can't be a formula, right? The reason is because notice that if invoice details, the same cell, look at the same cell is located here. So to do that, what I need to do is I need to save this information somewhere else and load it in. We don't want work date linked to this cell because now it would be invoice number. So it's the same cell. So we want to make sure that when we make a change here, it gets saved somewhere else. So if I want to change it back to date, I can do that, and that's going to. So how do we do that? Well, what we want to do is we always want to save this information separately somewhere else that it can be stored, and then we can bring it back. So as soon as I select out and select in, I want those item details to be brought back in, including the item, the show, and label. So all this information gets brought back. So where are we going to store it? Well, we can store it basically in columns. We can just store it off to the side. So that's exactly what I've done. If we take a look here on the right side, I've stored all this information here. If we take a look, we've got our information here. We've got whether we're showing it or hiding it. This U is actually based on a font. So if I were to change that font to Wingdings, you would see it's just the same thing. So it's just the check mark in the Wingdings font. So that's all it is. No difference, just a different font, but it's the same character. The font here doesn't matter at all. The font here certainly does matter. So if we take a look in here and we see that it's automatically Wingdings font. So when it's the same character, notice it's the same character, just the Wingdings font. So basically what I want to do is store any changes that are made, I want it to do here. So the invoice, the value. So we have the item, we have whether we're showing or hiding. What is the label? So if I change a label, I want it changed here, because this is the information. So if I just, let's say I want to add a colon to the invoice number, probably should have a colon. So I want to do that right here. So that's part of the invoice details. And I want to add a colon to that. So I'm just simply going to go up and I'm going to add that colon. Now that change, I want that change to be reflected inside here. So notice that it's been reflected here. So how do I know that that happens? Well, we can use a little formula. I need to also know which particular tab has been selected. Is it company details? Is it customer details? Or is it item details? We have 4 different sections. So if we take a look inside here, we also have invoice details, company details, customer details, and item details. So I want to make sure. Now these are simply the columns that are going to help guide us. 27, 28, 29, 30, these are the columns. Notice we're using a formula. Okay, so back into our code. So we want to make sure that we only make these changes if B10 equals false, then exit this up. Exit in less than an edit mode. Notice that we do have an edit mode in here, so I only want these changes to happen when edit mode. So when this is turned off, notice, take a look at B10 goes to false. If this is turned on, we'll go over the macros on this. This goes to true. You know, if there's any changes on here, I don't want anything to happen when B10 is false, only when it's true. This is going to tell us our edit mode is true. So that's the first thing. If it is false, then we're simply going to exit the sub because we're not in edit mode. Okay, we're going to dimension the item label shape as a shape. I want an item label shape because I need to create individual shapes. So if we take a look inside here, all these items, this is the shape. This is the label shape called customer label. This is also a shape called customer. So we're grouping them so that we can easily move them around. That way, if we want to move up invoice, I can move it up here. Or if I want to create, so notice that our label and our field are mixed together into 2 different shapes, and we've grouped them called invoice number group. So we want to make sure that we use these labels. So we're going to do that. Okay, so first of all, if we make a change of show or hide label, notice that there's a change. If I make a selection, now this is a selection, but if I make a change here, I need to know whether we're going to hide or show that label. If I take a look if I unselect it, you see that labels, both are gone. If I show it, if I just want to hide the label, I can delete it here. And it's going to delete, let's put delete here. So notice now it just shows 6. So I've deleted the label. So we can show or hide the label, which can be kind of helpful. So we can show it again simply by typing it in. So that gives us the ability to both, 1, show or hide the entire group if we don't want to show anything, or maybe we only want to show the value. For example, on these customers, notice that the address doesn't have a label. We could put it in if we wanted to, but it may not be helpful. So notice, now it says address, but we may not want that, right? So if we delete that, I only want to show the client. I only want the client to have a label. We can change it back to customer now too as well. Okay, so these are types of changes. So we're going to focus on this type. If F and the row doesn't equal show, right? It's blank, then we need to hide it. So how are we going to do that? Okay, so let's take a look inside this. If the user makes a change anywhere from F13 to G22, starting up here, F13 all the way down to G22, because we don't necessarily know exactly which one, because invoice details has all of them, company details. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that there is a value on the left in column E. If the user makes a change to, let's say here, and I delete this, I don't want anything to happen. Why is that important? Because there's nothing here in column E, so there's nothing to do here. So we're going to make sure if F to G, if they make a change And I also want to make sure B8 is false. What does that mean? What is B8 false? Well, that means menu load is false. Notice that when I select something, this is a change event too, right? So when I make a selection change, notice B8 goes to true. So that again is a different type of change. So we're differentiating between this type of change and the type of change where the user makes a change to the label or makes a change to the show or hide. Those are two different types of changes. I need to differentiate that. And B8 is going to tell us when the menu's loading, this is going to go to true, and then it's going to go back to false. So B8 must be false. And also, again, I want to make sure that E in the target row value doesn't equal empty. And that means basically we need to have something in column E here. We want nothing to happen. So that's why when all of those conditions happen, then what I want to do is I want to know what item type row. This is the item type. The item type is either invoice details, company details, customer details, or item details. So how do we know that? Well, the macro that's going to run, and I'll show you that macro, is going to set this type. And we're going to use this type B9. So the selected item type row is either going to be 13, 14, 15, or 16. So we're going to set that in B9. That's the type row. That's going to let us know which type has been selected. It's going to come directly from B9 right here, B9. So 13 through 16, any one of those values. Okay, so I want to set the item column. Now this item column is important. I want to know what column this is on. If I make a change to show, I need to know this is column 28. How do I know this is column? For the invoice details, let's take a look at the invoice details. If I make a change to here, to this column, column 6, I need to know to make sure that that should reflect on column 28. Notice it's empty there because that's where it gets saved. If I select it again here, I need to make sure it gets updated here. So how do I know that it's column 28? Well, I can use a little bit of a formula to do that, and it's this formula. First thing we're going to do is add 22. Why are we doing? Because that's the starting point. The starting point is going to be 22. And also, I want to add in something else. Now, notice that there's going to be 4 columns per type. 4 columns per type. You see here, 4 columns here, 4 columns here. So every type contains 4 columns. So it's going to be a multiple of 4. That's why we have the multiple of 4 here. Okay, so we're going to set the item type row minus 13. If we take a look inside here, the first one here, this is 13. So 13 minus 13 is 0. 13 minus 13 is 0. If I multiply that times 4, it's also 0. So if I take 22 and the target column, what am I going to get? The target column is 6, so it's going to give us 28. Meaning, if I make a change to here, this is column 6. If I take 13, I subtract 13, it's 0. I multiply times 4, it's 0. So 6 plus 22 equals 28. Now, if we use that same formula, but it's 14. So here is company details. If I unselect here, I make a change to here, this is now 14. So 14 minus 13 is 1. I multiply that times 4, I get 4. So I'm going to add 6 plus 4 is 10. And I add that to 22, I'm going to get 32. And 32 is the exact column that I want to change. So we're simply using math to get to that column, whether it's 28, 32, and we're using this formula here to do that. So simply this formula will allow us to get the column to save, column to save to. So once we have the column, and also I kept the rows the same, meaning, look, this starts on row 13. So that's kind of nice. So it's always the same row. That makes it a lot easier. So we know the rows. The row that we want to save it to, which is this row here, is always going to be the same row as the one we changed. So we know the row, we know the column, and now we can make the change. So to do that, we're going to do this. Cells, the target row, we know the column is simply equal to the target value. Update, call this data table, okay? So off data table. So we're going to update data table with the information that we made change. And what's the update? Whatever we've made the change. And this is going to work also for the labels too. So if I want to add this company name here, this label here, and although it's up here, I want to make sure that gets saved here to column 33. So just like that, it automatically gets saved. If I delete it, it's going to be deleted there. Okay, so that's how we get change events. That's how we get whatever we make changes here to automatically save here. And it's very important because once it's saved here, then I can bring it back in because I've got to clear out all the information. When I make changes here, I need to bring that information back in. So that's exactly where it gets saved. Okay, on change of label, show or hide label, but not on detail columns. What does that mean? On change of item details is different. These are the columns, right? So there's the label here is formula. So we don't want to show or hide. However, so that means these are the labels, right? If I unhide this, we're going to unhide a column. It's kind of different than invoice details, where if I decide I'm going to unhide the invoice date, right? If I want to unhide that, I want to unhide the whole thing. So these three are very different than these. This is columns, and these are all fields. So the first three are all fields. So how do we differentiate them too? So if we're making a change to anywhere from column G, we're focused on column G, and B9 does not equal 16. What does that mean? If B9 is 16, then we know that it's item details. They get handled very differently because these are all columns in our invoice. However, everything else, so 13, 14, and 15 are fields. These are going to get handled all the same. So we're going to treat them. So as long as it's not 16, we're going to do something else. I want to set the item label shape. I want to determine, does this label shape exist? What is the label shape? It would be this shape right here. It's called customer label. It's very unique to that, just that field. But what I want to do is I want to see, does it exist? Right? If I make a change to here, I need to find it. Right? If I make that change, I want to find it. So where is that? When I make a change to G, where is it located? Does this shape exist? Customer label. So how do we know that? Well, we're going to set the item label shape. This is the shape variable. It's going to be E. What's in E? E is here. E is that information. So this doesn't change. So this underscore label is the name of that shape. Take a look at the name of this shape. It's called customer underscore LBL. So we always name our labels and our shapes based on the item. This doesn't change. This is the text. This does change. So this doesn't change. So we can give it a very fixed name. So this would be address underscore LBL, city, state, and so on and so forth. So that's going to give us a name. So what I want to do is I want to know if it exists or not. So if the target value equals empty, what does that mean? If the target value equals empty, it means if I delete that, the target value is empty. What do I want to do? Well, in that case, what I want to do is I want to hide the label shape. So we're setting the label and then we're hiding it. So we're simply going to hide it there. However, if it's not empty, what we want to do is I want to display it. Item label shape visible equals true. So we're simply hiding or showing the label based on whether it's there or not. So simply put, as soon as I change a value to customer, I want that label shape to appear, and I want it to appear right here. Great, so we notice how, I'll show you, of course, how to create them and position them, but I just want to show you we're just going in order. So that's all we need to do. Just we're going to show or hide those label shapes based on the change directly inside here. Continuing on, now that we have that, now we're going to focus on the selection change code. A lot of things happen when we make selection changes. I want to make sure that you know exactly how to do that. So what's the first thing we're going to focus on? We're going to dimension the item name as a string and the item shape as a shape, the item label. So there's a lot of things going on selection change. So we've got some shapes that we're going to be dimensioning here. Now what I want to do is, if the target count large, we're going to use 2 in this case. And the reason is sometimes we have larger fields that are named ranges. And the reason is sometimes we have merged cells such as this, and the merged cells, notice that this one is a merged cell. So I want something to happen when we make a selection change. So that's why we have it on 2, because this field is column E and F. So this is 2 merged cells. So if the user makes a selection on anything larger, we don't want it to happen. But if it's 2, it's okay. So that's why anything larger than 2, we're exiting the sub. So if you're going to use that pop-up calendar and you use it on a merged cell like I have here, keep in mind that if you do include this code, make sure that this is larger, of course, than the number of cells you have in your merged cell. Okay, first thing what I want to do is I just want to make sure that we have that calendar. If it doesn't exist, that little pop-up date picker, if it doesn't exist, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a macro that replaces it. And basically all that macro does is copies it from here and it places it into the current sheet. So that's the macro. That's all that it does. If the calendar is visible, we're going to hide it. And that just means if I've selected the calendar and I select anything else, I just want that calendar, the date picker, to be hidden. So that's it for that. And then also the visible, we're just going to run the macro to hide it. If the user makes a selection on E4, E8, J10, or through J44 is nothing, then what do we want to happen? I want that pop-up calendar to appear. E4, E8, both day fields, or any cell within column J between J10 and J44, I want that calendar to display. So to do that, we are going to do this. Then we're going to check for the sheet. This is a macro. Now they're all located, and we're not going to go over this because it's a lot. They're all located here. Basically, a lot of the macros here, this just runs a calendar. We're just checking for the sheet. So that's obviously involved. So if we've got calendar show, you can go through these macros. We're not going to go through that. Okay, so basically what I want to do is I just want to display that on that. So we're going to check for sheet and we're going to run the macro that displays the calendar. Otherwise, we're going to run the macro that hides the calendar. That's it. What I want to focus on here now is the tax selection change, but not an invoice loaded. Well, it's relatively simple. If the current selection is a checkbox, we want to clear it. If the current selection is clear, we want to put a checkbox. And after every time we make a selection, we're going to select away from the current cell. In this case, we're going to use P8. So it's relatively simple. That checkmark is simply character 252. How do I know that it's character 252? If I go to insert and I click symbol and I want to insert that checkmark and I want to look under wingdings, or probably wingdings 1, I believe is where it's located, and I find that checkmark here, all the way down here at the bottom here, or wherever it's located inside this list, and I locate it, which is right here, and then I find it and I see that it is character 252, wingdings 252. You can see that right there. That's how I know it's character 252. So if you want to use any character, you simply know the font, and then you define the character equivalent, and you want to use this character equivalent inside VBA. So that's all you have to do. That's how we got to the 252. So inside the code, it's very simple. Simply, if the user makes a selection on anywhere from P10 through P44, then, and I also want to make sure B1 is false, meaning the invoice is not loading. That's critical. When the invoice loads, we're going to be pulling the information, what is located in the database. If all of that happens, then what I want to know is if the current value is that checkbox, then I simply want to clear it. Otherwise, I want to put in that character 252. And then the last thing is I want to select something other than the current cell. In this case, we're going to use P8. That's it. That's all we have to do on that. Okay, so continuing on inside our code, the next thing we're going to focus again on those invoice changes. So as far as selection change, we only have the events that come under the tax and the calendar. All the other selection change happen in this customized invoice. So and basically, we're going to be focused on column F and column D. So when I make a selection on column D, what do I want to happen? Well, when I make a selection anywhere from column D13, D16, I want to load the items that are associated with the invoice details, company, customer, or item details. So that's the first thing we are going to focus. Now, we only want this to happen when B10, again, as I mentioned, we want to make sure when B10 is false, meaning when not in edit mode. When in edit mode is false, nothing's going to happen. So if this turns false, selecting on this does absolutely nothing because B10 turns to false. So only when it is true are we going to be doing. If it is false, we're simply going to exit the sub at this point. When we make a selection on an invoice item menu select, anywhere from D13 to D16, we want something to happen. First thing we're going to set B8 to true. That menu change item goes to true, and then before we finish off, we're going to set it to false. I also want to set B9 to the target value. Remember, inside our cell here, B9, we want to set it to the row that was selected. 13, 14, 15, or 16. As we select it, we want the row, and that's simply how we know exactly which item was selected, so that we know that. And it's also going to trigger conditional formatting here. Why don't we go ahead and take a look inside conditional formatting just for this rule. If we manage rule, we see that when we make a change, B9 equals row, we want to give it that dark blue background, the white bold font, and it's going to cover everything from D12. Actually, we should change that to D13 to D16. D13 is fine, but either way, it's going to work. So that's all we have to do there. So that's just going to conditional formatting. So when we make that selection, we want to do that. So it does two things. It triggers a conditional formatting, and it sets which type, set type, and trigger conditional formatting. So then what I want to do is I want to clear everything out. E13 through G22, meaning starting from here, E13, all the way through G22. So this entire 3 columns here, these rows here, all get cleared out. So the first thing that happens is everything gets cleared out here. Then what I want to do is I want to determine and load everything else up front. So once we determine that, I want to know the item column. Again, we're going to use that same formula. This time we're starting at 27. And why is that? Because I want to bring all this information in here. Everything. So all of this information, the invoice, I want to bring it starting at column 27. So how do we know it's 27 or 31? So we're going to try to get this number. 27, 31, 35, and 39. It's every 4 columns, so we know that. So again, we're going to use a little bit of a formula. Target row. Now, when this target row is 13, 13 is that first item selection, invoice details. So if I select this, I know this is 13. It means I want to bring everything in here directly from starting in column 27. The rows are the same, 13 all the way through 22. So how do I get that 27? Basically, if I have 13, how do I get 27? We can do this. 13 minus 13 is 0, times 4 is also 0, so 27 plus 0 is 0. If it's 14 minus 1 times 4 is 4, plus 27 is 31. So we just use that formula, whether we want 27, 31. If I know the columns, so then it's going to be the starting column plus 3 to get us all the columns. So that's all we need to do right here. So we're E13 through G22. This is the range that we want to bring it into. This is our destination range, E13, all the way through G22 equals what? Equals cells, our starting column at 27, 13, all the way through our ending column, all the way through 22. So how do we get that? Our starting column is 13. It's item column. Our ending column is item column plus 2. And of course, we're going to leave the labels. So we're just adding one here, 22. That's all we have to do. Simply adding. It's going to bring all the item details in. The item column plus 2. And the reason is plus 2 is because we don't want to bring the values. The actual values are going to stay here. Here's the value. So all I want to do is bring these 3 columns in. That 4th column will stay right here. And we haven't gone over the values yet. We will go over that very soon. So what I want to do is I want to focus on this. So this information, these 3 columns, the starting column plus 2 gets brought in and gets brought in. So that's how we can bring this information in. And that's all we need to do. So we're going to load the item details and change before to false. So that means on selection change of anything, it's going to load that menu. And that's how we get the conditional formatting. So that is how we get this feature quickly available using, basically it looks like a vertical tab feature, tabbing the cells and loading the information in, but we're using the same columns and the same rows. All we need to do is store the data somewhere else. So that's how we do that. Next up, on show or hide selection, on show or hide. If I show or hide, this is going to be a selection change event from column F all the way to F13, all the way to 22, assuming that there's a value in E. So we're going to check on that. So now what do we want to do? We want to show or hide the information. Okay, however, this one's show or hide selection. So F13 through F22, and E must contain a value. For customer details, when E doesn't contain anything, nothing will happen. When E contains a value, I want it to show up. I want something to show up. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So first of all, we're going to dimension the in here. We have the width. I want to know the width of this, and this is going to be our invoice width and our description width. I'm going to show you this in just a moment. And basically, this is going to be used for our columns, our width. So and the reason is for this. If I notice that the width, we have a certain amount of width here. And if I remove a certain column like date, I want that width to stay the same. The only difference is that item description became larger. Take a look at the width of the item description. When I select on date, item width gets reduced, but the entire width of the invoice stays exactly the same. So we're going to be using that, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. Okay, we're going to set that item shape to nothing, and we're going to set the label shape to nothing. We're going to be using these as shapes. We need both of those. If the target value equals character 252, meaning it's currently displayed, then we want to clear the contents, else the target value equals 252. And basically, it's the same thing we did for tax. If the target value equals that character 252, we're going to clear it. If it doesn't, that's all we're going to do. So it's very, very simple as far as this is concerned. Then continuing on. Okay, so the item type row, again, we're going to put that into a long variable from B9. I want to know what type row. And that's very important because item details is handled very differently than these. So 13, 14, and 15 are handled very differently, and 16 is different because these are columns. So I need to differentiate between those two. So the item row is also the target row. I want to set the item row. So what row have we selected? And that's going to be there. So it's important. I want to know what row we've been selected. Here, when we make a selection, I want to know what row. It's very important to know what row because I need to know what is the item that we're going to be focused on. In this case, it's company name. Okay, so we have that into a variable called item row. Once I know that variable, if the item details are selected, then show or hide the columns. When are we going to show or hide the columns? I'm going to show or hide the columns only when this is 16, item details. Only then am I going to be showing or hiding columns. So if the item type row is 16, then it's the item details column. We're going to do all this only for those item columns. We're going to set the item column to be the target row minus 3. What does that mean? Well, I need to know what column. What column is this? This is column, if we take a look at it, we see that this is column 10. So if I know this is column 10, and I'm focusing on this, and I see this, what row is this? This is row 13. So date is row 13, item is 14, and it's item 11. So basically, column 10 corresponds to row 13. If I know they've selected row 13, how do I get to column 10? I get to column 10 simply because, and the reason that I selected just two, notice just two, selection change on two is okay, but it created a bin. So on error resume next would work for that, and that's because two. Normally we don't allow two. If I were to select more than two, it wouldn't have this bug, and simply because we have one is fine, but if I select more than two, no problem. But two, the reason we did that is because we're allowing two here. We're allowing the selection change of more than two right here. So that's why that bug appeared. Something like on error resume next would be fine in that case. Okay, so that's just the reason we selected two cells. So continuing on. So if I know I've selected row 13 and I want to get to column 10, all I need to do is subtract 3 to get that. And that's just what we do here. To determine which column we're going to be affecting, we're simply subtracting 3. So we're going to do that all the way down right here. Item column, the column is the target row minus 3. It's going to set that item column. Now, if the target value equals empty, then we're hiding the column, right? We've already adjusted here. So what are we going to hide or are we going to show the column? If this is blank, we're going to hide the column. If it's check mark, we're going to show that column. So to do that, if the target column, we're going to hide the column. Cells, we're just going to say item column, entire column hidden equals true. This is one of many ways to hide a column. That will be fine. That's going to hide it. Otherwise, we're just choosing any row, entire column hidden equals false. So simply showing or hiding columns. But now what I want to do importantly is if I were just to hide this column, such as this, notice I don't want it all shrunken like this. I want that invoice to maintain that particular width. I want to maintain the width. So what I'm going to do is compensate and determine what the description, either use this description field because it's almost always going to be visible. I want to use this field to add or remove some pixels based on the width so that we can adjust for it. So when we unhide it, so that's how we're going to do that. So let's unhide it. So basically, again, as I mentioned before, if we are unhiding something, I want that description to compensate for that. So here's how we're going to do it. Now, I want to know the total width, but instead of adding the entire range width, this is kind of a long way to do it. There's a quicker way. In other words, I could do the column width. This doesn't work. This doesn't give us the correct total. You would think it does, but it doesn't. Invoice width equals, you could do range J through, let's say P dot width. Doesn't give us the correct number. Columns width, and then this doesn't work also. J through P, that doesn't work either, a single column. So this is kind of a long way. So this is going to determine the width of all the columns, right? I wish that I tried the other way, it didn't work. So that's okay. What we're going to do is we're going to take the column width of each column. I want to know what is the current width combined of all the columns all the way from J through P. I'm going to put that into a variable called the invoice width. And then what I'm going to do is I need to determine what is the width of the current description. And that's going to be the width of column L. So now what I need to do is I'm going to use this measurement. This is the total measurement. We could also use the invoice width here. So basically it's going to determine, I think I can use this here, this one right here, greater than. So if the invoice width is greater, this is the total number of pixels for that invoice based on that. So if it's the total, this is just calculated based on the total width. If the invoice width is greater, right, then what I need to do is increase the column width for L. So it's too big. So we're going to take that description width and we're going to subtract to it from this calculated amount. This is just simply calculated based on the total width. The invoice width minus 93.6. So basically, it's kind of complex, but all we're doing is basically shrinking or expanding the description just to get it to the exact width that we have. I want it this width. What is that width in pixels? It is 54.6. Otherwise, it's also 93.6. So that's what's going to do it. So these are in pixels and these are in a different font here. So this is based on the font. Based on this column width. So all we're doing is just shrinking or expanding the description, and that's going to give us a constant width for the invoice, regardless if I decide to take out tax and I decide to take out date, that invoice width is going to remain constant. So I really wanted to do that. Okay, continuing on. Else, what if it's a field shape? So this is all for item details, everything we've been focusing on. However, what if they're making a selection change on one of the items? What do I want to do? Well, if they're unselecting it, if it's blank, then I want to hide something, this particular group. If it's displayed, I want to display it. So basically we're showing or hiding a group of shapes based on what that selection change is. So that's what we're going to check now. First of all, that item column, I want to set the item column. And what is that item column? Again, this time I want to focus on both the label and the value. So here we go. I want to set the item column. So what's the item column? We know this column. This label is in 29. Value is in column 30, 29 and 30. So these are the columns that I want, because I need to know what label to display inside that. And I also need to know what value I want to link that. So those are very important. So I need to get to that item column. Again, we're using the same formula. Our only difference is that starting point, because this time I want to get that value, and that value is located in, that label is located in 29, the value is located here. So our starting point is different. That's all we have to do. I want to know what the item name is. What's the item name? This remains constant. This isn't the label. That item name, which is located here, it's also located, the same item name is located right here. What is that item name? It's basically E in the selected row, E in that target row. That is the item name. I'm going to put that into a string variable called item name. Now what I want to do is I want to know, does that shape exist or not? If the shape doesn't exist, we need to create it. So how are we going to do that? For example, if I delete this, I'm just going to delete it. Okay, now it's gone. So if I unselect it, and I select it again, I need that recreated. Notice it's been recreated and it's put right here. So that got recreated. I deleted it and recreated. Now I just need to update it if I want, left justify it and make it look nice and update that. So basically that's all I have to do to update it here, and it just gets recreated. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can do that with just a little bit of a code. First of all, I need to check, does the shape exist or not? Now when it's created, I've created a group. I've combined both the label and the value with two shapes into a group, and that group is simply called the invoice number underscore group. So I've taken this name, put the underscore, and called it group. I want to check, does it exist or not? Or does the label shape exist? So first of all, the item shape is the shape's name and the item name. Now what is the item name? The item name is here. So does it exist or not? If it doesn't exist, we're going to create it. Now what is that item name? It is this value right here. So the value is simply the item name. So notice the value. The invoice has the word label. However, the name is simply the name, invoice. Let's take a look at the date group, this date item, date. So we've taken a shape and I've created it based exactly on, given the name exactly what the item name is in here, no different. So we're going to check, does it exist or not? So the item shape equals the shape's item name. If the item shape is nothing, it doesn't exist, then we need to create it and position it. So what if it's not, as long as it's not a logo, logos get handled a little bit differently. So if it's a logo and I delete the logo, let's delete that logo, that's going to get deleted differently. I want to then select on the logo and have it reappear, and then I can resize it and reposition it accordingly, however I want, and then that position will be remembered in the future. And then if I show or hide it, it's simply going to show or hide, remember it. So it's going to pull it directly from there. And how do we do that? Well, we can simply look in the code. And so if it's not a logo, we're going to do something. If it is, we're going to do something else. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, if it is not a logo, I want to take a sample shape that I've created right here. It's just a text box, and I've given it a name called sample invoice shape. So we're going to use this as our sample, and all I'm going to do is just duplicate this and rename it. And that's if it's one of these types of shape. If it's a logo, it's something different. So if it's shape, we're going to do just that. We're going to duplicate it. We're going to take that shape's sample invoice shape. We're going to duplicate it. We're going to assign it a name, and that name is going to be called the item name. We're going to create that shape if it's missing, and that's only if the item shape is nothing. What if it's a logo? If it's a logo, we need to insert a picture. And where's that picture going to be based on? It's going to be based on admin C10. That's where that picture file path is located. And I'm sure if it's empty, we can probably exit the sub out. I'll go ahead and we could probably add in some error checking on that because I didn't do that yet, just in case it's empty. So I'll add that in for you now. So basically we're going to look directly here to C10. If C10 is empty or C10 has an incorrect path, we're going to skip that. So let's do that right now. And I'm going to check if it's a logo. So we're going to look at this. If admin C10 value equals empty, or the directory of admin C10 VB directory equals empty, then we're going to skip it. Equals empty, then, or you can just put nothing actually. Then what do? We're going to skip it. We can exit the sub, or we can go to the next. There's nothing to insert that, so we can check for the label. So we'll continue to go and check for label. Then, okay, equals empty, check for label. Okay, so that's it. So now all we need to do is just simply add this marker and right down here checking for labels. So we're going to put that in here. Okay, looking good. Okay, so now that we have that, we've set up just an error check in case there's an issue. What if it's not an issue? What we're going to be doing is we're going to insert the pictures based on the file path here, now that we know it's a correct file path, and we're going to give it a very specific name. The name is going to be exactly the same, whether it's a shape, a text box, or whether it is a picture, same name. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to set it just a default position. So we're going to set the item shape. That item shape is going to be equal to shape's item name. So regardless if it is the logo picture or a shape, it's going to take on the same shape here. Now we can focus just on that with the item shape. If the item name does not equal logo, then what I want to do is I want to set a formula, meaning the value of it. Right? So I want to make sure here the value, what is that value going to be? Where's our values located? If this, we're going to look at AL13. So let's start out with the invoice details. Invoice number, where's that invoice number located? Well, all the values are here. It's on that fourth column. So for example, this is a formula that's equal to B4. This is the formula E7. So basically, I've just simply taken the terms and I've equaled that wherever it's located on here. And some take formulas and due date, footer message. Where's that footer message? We're going to look at that. I'm going to run a match. Now the footer message is a little bit different. Footer message, why is that important? Because the footer message, the actual message, this is the message here. Let me add a message. There's no message here currently. So let's say the summer sale. So we inside our admin, remember we have the message name, and we have the message, the footer message, the message text. So if I've selected a footer message and I want a formula, and I want that formula to reflect the footer message because the value of this footer message right here is, what is it located here? Save 30%, right? So save 30%. So that's the message. So what I want to get is this value. If I have selected here summer sale, then the value of that is save 30% on big summer sale. So how do I get that? Well, what we can do is we can use the index on that. So we're going to index. Now we've got a named range for the footer message. That's what I'm going to be indexing. We're matching whatever's in E9. E9 is the name of that footer message. And we're going to want an exact match based on the footer name. So I've created two named ranges, one for the names of the footer and one for the messages of the footer. And we need an exact match, and then we need it in column 1. So basically, this index match is simply going to return whatever message we have set for that footer. So basically, all of the values are formulated. The subtotal, I'll go over that in a moment with you. So basically, all the values are here. So how do we extract those values? As soon as we finish off with this line of code, we'll go into some of the formulas here. So how do we get that? Well, we know it's on the 30th column. So it's the fourth column here. The same thing here. All the values are here. The values for the company, the values for the customer, and that's it. The item details doesn't have values. Those are columns. So just those three. So how do we pull that out? Well, with the formula is relatively simple. All we want, the drawing object formula equals the cell, the item row, it's the same row, the item column plus 1. How do we know it's the item column? Because we're focused on this item column, this item. So the labels in 29. So the value is column plus 1. So what is it? So all I need is equals and the address of that. I want AD13. I want AD14 as the formula. So we're going to get the address of that, and we're going to combine it with the equal sign, and that's going to be equals. So that means that we can automatically link the value of this invoice number with AD13. So notice the address plus the equals. So the same thing for the invoice date. So it's equal to AD14. So we're linking this automatically. Therefore, when we make a change here, automatically changes here, and that's simply because it is linked directly to here. So we're simply linking that. And we're using VBA that's going to help us link that item. And that's only if it's not a logo, right? Logos don't have a formula link, they're just a picture. However, logos do have the left top position and also placement and move. In this particular, we're setting the default left position based on L1, and we're setting a default top position on L5. We could have set anywhere within the invoice, that's fine. And then also placement and move. And the reason we're doing this is I do not want these to move or size with the particular columns. For example, if I shrink this column down, I don't want these fields to move. So we're setting the placement to move or size. And if we want to reset that, just reset the text, and it's going to reset that. So I want to make sure that every time that I add these text boxes or position them, I want to set the placement as equal to move, but not size. So it's right here, placement equals XL move. Let's just put in move, but not size with cells or columns. that end with is automated on auto hotkey. That's why it came up. Okay, so that's all we want to do. We want to make sure that those shapes don't move, and that's why we're adding in the placement. Okay, so that's it for placing the shapes. That covers our actual value shapes here. But what about our label shapes here? We haven't focused on our labels. I also want to create labels shapes with our labels. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's coming up now. So we're going to focus on that. So here we're going to check for item label shape. Now, if there's nothing in here, that means we're not going to create a label. We're only, not that one, sorry. These are item details, customer details, company details. So for example, customer details, we're only creating a label for customer. If I select this or unselect this, I only create the label if there's a value in column G. So we're going to check for that. First of all, we're going to make sure to see if the label exists. So we're going to check item label shape is simply equal to the item name and the underscore label. That's the name that we're going to give to every label. What I want to know, does it exist? So we're going to wrap it in on air resume next and on air go to 0. If the label item is nothing, then we need to create and position the label shape. So again, just like we did with the value, we are going to set shapes, sample invoice shape, duplicating that sample shape, that same one here, the same exact one. We're simply duplicating that, and we're giving it a unique name called item name and then underscore label. That's going to create shape if it's missing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to position it. Notice we only do all this if it doesn't exist. If it does exist, all we're going to do is simply display it. Okay, so set the label shaped item, and then we're going to focus again. We're giving it this time we're giving it a formula. This time, item row and item column. What does that mean? Item row and item column. Here's the column here, 29, or it is 33. So we're using this column. Before it was +1, which is the value. So now I just want to do the label, because this is what gets changed automatically. So I want it to equal the label. So whatever's located in AC, I'm going to give it that formula. That is the formula. Again, it's going to be equals cell item row, cell item address. Okay, actually, we don't need to check for the label because logos don't have a label. I don't think, oh, they could. I don't know if we put a label for logo. Probably shouldn't, but I guess we did have a logo. Yeah, I guess logos can have labels too. I don't know why you would want that, but it does. So I guess we do skip to the logos if you want it on there. But if we delete it, it's gone. Okay, so continuing on. Now, what we want to do is we want to place it also somewhere in our invoice, and then also the same place to move. So we're doing exactly did move but don't size. Okay, great. So now we've created both the item shape for the item and the label. What I'd like to do is I'd like to group them. And I group them together, and that's nice and important because once they're grouped together, they can be moved together very nicely. So what I want to do is I want to take both the label and the item and group them together in a unique group, and I want to call that group the name underscore and then group. So we're going to do that right here. Okay, so we're going to know, does the group exist or not? We're going to run a test. Again, we're setting the group shape to shapes, item name, and the underscore group. I've got to know, does it exist or not? If the group shape is nothing, then we're going to simply create it. We're going to create an array. It's basically two items within the group. So shapes, range, array. What are those two items? One is the item shape name, and what is the item label shape name? So we're simply taking those two and we're grouping them, and we're giving it a very specific name called item name and then underscore group. Also with the group as well, I want to place move but don't size. So the same thing, just as we did with the shape, both shapes up, we're moving but not sizing. We don't want that sized when we shrink or expand the columns. Okay, great. So we've now created the group, and the group's all set up. Now what I want to know, if the target value equals empty, what does that mean? Well, if the target value is empty, and remember, we're focused here, this is a lot of code here, on column F. So if the target value is empty, meaning we're going to hide that. We don't want to hide the group. So let's do that here. If the target value is empty or the target offset value is empty, what does that mean? That means if this is empty or this is empty, either one, whether it is show or label, what are we going to do then? Then I want to ungroup and hide on the empty label. So one of those are empty, and that's the reason. The reason is, let's just say this is empty, right? I don't want to group. Notice there's a single item. I don't want to group the name with this. So let's say this is the customer. Let's go into customer. Let's say we have a label on this called address. So we put the label, and notice that they're both, well, actually, they're not grouped together. So I unselect this and select it. I probably could fix that. Now they're grouped together. But I guess I could group them together when I change this. That might be helpful. So now they're grouped together. And so basically the idea is when somebody removes this, I want to then not group them together. And so when they unselect this and select this again, notice they're not grouped. It's kind of wonky. I could probably do a little bit more code, add more code to group them or ungroup them. But basically the idea is if we're not showing a label, I don't want them group. I don't want that label grouped. I don't want that label grouped. So that's all we have to do is just kind of unique it. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to check if the value is empty, meaning we're not displaying it, or the label is empty. Here's the label. Then we're going to hide, ungroup, and hide on empty label. So we're going to do that checking to see if it's existing, to make sure it exists. We're going to ungroup it at this point because I don't want to have it a hidden group. And then we're going to hide the label. We're hiding that label here. So basically that's it. So if it's grouped together, let's add a name here. Let's show you that one more time so you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to add it here. You see that they're both grouped together. And as soon as I remove this and then unselect this or select this again, we want to make sure it's not grouped together, okay? All right, so that's all we did there, just group it. So it's easier to work with when it's not grouped with something that's hidden. Else, other than then something is visible, then we want to make sure that label is visible, meaning it's not empty. We want to show that label. Okay, if the target value is empty, then we're also going to hide the shape. What does that mean? That means that if this is empty, we're hiding this shape as well. If it's visible, we're going to show it. So I also want to unhide that item. That's all we have to do with this, simply hiding that item. Okay, otherwise, if it's visible, right? Let's go ahead and hidden or visible. So that's it. So just making sure that those items are visible. After they've been grouped and we've created all the right names, we're simply going to show or hide it accordingly. And then we're going to select something else, just another cell, F2. Okay, great. So we've covered that. So now we understand how the labels work. And now we understand, let's continue with this. That's it for the selection change code. Before I forget, let's go ahead and go over some of these formulas. Now, we kind of understand the invoice details are simply linked to the items on the invoice sheet. The footer message we went over. Now the subtotal, this is kind of an interesting, because normally it would be like, okay, well, let's just use the sum and total all these. Well, that's nice and dandy if we have a single page invoice, but what if we have multiple page invoices? For example, let's take a look at invoice number 1 here. We'll pull that up. And we can see that invoice number 1 has 4 pages. Now, I want to know the total of the invoice. I don't want to know this. So if I were to sum this equal sum of just a single page, right, that's not going to give us the accurate total. Why is that? Because this invoice has multiple pages, right? So the total of this page is 7114. We could do a page subtotal. We could add another line here called page subtotal. That might be handy. If you're a Patreon member and you want to see a page subtotal, let me know and I'll put that in here. So, but I want the invoice total because there's additional pages. If we take a look here, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, right? So I need to make sure that all of these pages get totaled into that subtotal and then the taxes are added. So how do we do that? Well, what we can use is use the sum ifs, right? So let's take a look inside our invoice items and we have here amounts and totals here. So I've created some named range that will help us with that. So if we go into the formulas, name manager, and we look under invoice item. So we've got invoice item total. I've got a named range for that. So that's going to help us out. Invoice item total. I also have another one called invoice item ID here, invoice item ID. So it's based on the ID. And then I have invoice item tax here, whether it's taxed or not. And so those 3, invoice item ID, tax, and total, are going to help us add that up. So let's take a look back inside the invoice. And we're going to take a look back inside that total. I want that subtotal, not including tax, of all of the totals. So how do we do that? We're going to use a sum if. And what are we summing? We're going to sum if all the invoice item totals, but we're only basing it on those with the invoice item of B4. So that's going to get us the subtitle. So it's going to basically look in all of these items, all the totals based only on invoice number 1, regardless of page, and it's going to look for those, and it's going to total up all the totals based on that invoice. Okay, that's nice for tax, but what if we have tax? Well, the first thing is, are we charging sales tax? Notice this cell is called tax option, yes or no, okay? This one's called tax rate. So I've given named ranges to help us inside the formula. So going back into the invoice here, we're gonna look at the total tax. So now we can use, if the tax option equals yes, we're gonna run a sum. Otherwise, we're gonna simply leave it blank. Otherwise, it's 0. So what if it's yes? Then we're gonna use sum ifs, multiple, right? So now what I need to know is I need to know the invoice item total. This is what we're going to sum. The invoice item, the invoice ID, and also I need to know if B4 is the invoice item and if it's taxable. Is it taxable or not? Inside a formula. Before we just used it inside VBA. Now we're using it looking for that checkbox. We only want to total the items, add tax to those items only that are checked, not the ones that are unchecked. Once we have all that, those totals, we're simply going to multiply it times the tax rate. So that's how we get the total tax based on only the taxable items. Remember, in the invoice, only those items with that character 252. So this item would not get taxed because there's no character 252. This umlaut, this U with the 2 dots, is also known as character 252. This is the same as that checkbox, just we change the font to Wingdings, and we're going to see that again, that's the checkbox. Okay, just so this is the same thing, even though it's just the font difference, but it's the characters exactly the same. Okay, also into the formula, then all I want to know is the invoice total, and that's simply going to be the sum of these two. That's going to get us there. I also want to display the page number, page what of what. So how do we do that? Well, it's simply this. Now I took the page text, and this is simply the selected page is always going to be in B11. The total pages is always going to be in B4. So then I just combine them with a formula. So equals page and then empty space, space B11, and then of course and quotation marks, space of, and B12. That's going to combine that to create that string. And this is important because then I can combine that inside a string, and we can combine that right here. So this is simply equal to B13. And then this particular shape all the way down at the bottom is the formula AD22, page 4 of 4. And that way, as soon as I go to a previous page, this changes and everything updates automatically based on what's in AD22. So that's here, right here, page 3 of 4. Okay, now we also have some cell links for our company details. Now, most of our company details are located in the admin here from C5 all the way down to C10. So that's just simply linked all the way here, C5, C6, C10, and everything down here. So it's simply just linked here, very simple. Inside the customer details, we have some links here. This is equal to E5, which of course is our customer name right here, located in E5. And if we continue on, I want to extract information from it. Now I need to know a customer row. Now that customer row is right here. It's based on the customer name. We have a named range here in the name manager here. If we look inside the customer name, just like we have the other names, we're using the offset, and I've got a customer name here. I want to know what row is associated with that customer. Our customers start on row 3. Therefore, we're going to use an if error match E5 customer name row plus 2. This is going to get us that row 3. I want to know what's associated. If it's empty, if we clear that out, then I know that we do not have a customer, and I know if this is blank, then we do not have a customer. So what I want to do is when I select the customer, I want to make sure this information automatically updates. So this is linked to AL13, this is linked to AL14, and this is AL15. And if we take a look inside here, we have that customer link here, AL13. What we're going to use an indirect. We want to extract the information. If I know that customer row, I want to extract the address from column C, extract the city and the state, the zip, and the phone, and the email, all based on those particular columns. And as long as I know the row and I know the column, then I can extract that information. And that's we're going to use the indirect formula to do that. So indirect customers C and B through. We know B3 is the customer row. So we just bring it down to we know that the customers, now we're combining city, state, and zip into a single line. Therefore, we're using multiple indirects. D plus a space, a comma, and then a space. E, so we got the city, we got the state, and we got the zip code in column F, combining all the city, state, and zip into a single line string. We have the customer phone number, and we have the customer email here. We could probably format that. Okay, great. So that's it for the formulas. That's how we link all the formulas, and that's how we create those shapes to create the formulas. Okay, next up, we're going to go into some of the other macros that help us create this incredible invoice. inside one of our modules called the admin menu macros, I've got a few miscellaneous macros I'd like to share with you. The first is one that you saw called add company logo. And basically all that this macro does is it takes our folder here, browses a folder, whichever one we want, and we're just looking for a logo. And it's going to take that file path of that logo and put this directly into cell C10. This allows us to open that picture and share it on the invoice. So all we're doing is taking the file path of that and putting it directly into C10. Pretty much. So for this, all we need to do is just dimension the logo pic as a file dialog and the picture path, which we can use. So we're going to set that logo picture as the application file dialog. Now this is going to be a file picker. Now if we wanted just a folder, it would be folder picker. However, all we want is a file. And we're going to give it a specific title. So with that logo picture, that title is going to be please select a logo picture. We're going to give the user some abilities to add just some picture types, JPEG, PNG, GIF. We could add a few more, JPEG or some GIF or a few other things, but basically it's going to be a picture type file. We're only allowing them to select one single file, therefore the allow multi-select is false. If they don't make any selection, we do want to skip this line, so we're going to go all the way down here if they don't make any selection. If they do make a particular selection, we're going to take the path of that selected item, that single selected item, and we're going to put it into this variable called picture path. We're then going to take that picture path and we're going to put it directly into the admin C10. That is it. Okay, another one you saw was edit mode. This is a particular one. When I select this is called edit mode. It's going to be on or off. It is the same macro that is assigned to this shape or this little circle here. So it's the same macro regardless of what they are selecting. So if we were to go into click assign macro, we would see that it is called the edit mode macro. That's the one I wanted to go over with you now. So we're going to dimension the move, and it's going to allow us to create this cool little button. So the move increment or move INC as long and a button move as long. Okay, we're going to focus on some shapes here. Now, to know this, we're really dealing with two shapes. One is this background called edit mode back, and the other is this little button that we're going to not only move, but we're going to change the color. It's called edit mode switch. And so when it moves right to left, it changes the color, and also it does this, it hides whatever the edit information is here for the invoice. When we turn it on, it does just the opposite. Okay, so first we're going to go over this particular button. Now, how do we get this to move over, and how do we get it to change colors? Well, it really depends on the current status. If we take a look at the text inside the shape, it's basically on. If I turn it here, the text itself changes to off. So we're simply changing the text inside the shape when we make that switch. So to do that, to know its current position, in other words, if the current text is on, I know to move it to the left and change it to gray. If the current text is off, I can move to the right and change it to gray. Now we could use we also have another setting, this true or false here in the edit mode. So we could use either one of those things changed. Well, we're going to use the text inside the shape. So here we go. We're focused on that invoice sheet here. If the shape's edit mode, this is the back, we're focused on the text of that shape. So the text frame 2, text range text, if it's off, then we know to turn it on, right? So we're basing that toggle off whatever the text is. If the text is off, we need to turn it on. If the text is on, we need to turn it off. So we can use that as a toggle. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that edit mode switch, that's that ball shape, that round circle shape, and what we're going to do is we're going to change that color, that fill 4 color RGB. We're going to change it to the green color. Now that RGB green is 0, 176, and 80. Well, how do I get that? If you want to know how do I get that RGB value, all we need to do is just go into the home and then actually shape format here, the shape fill. And if we go into more fill colors, we're going to see that it's got that green color. And now all you do is grab the RGB from here, 0, 176, and 80. And we can put that directly inside here, inside our VBA under here, 0, 176, and 80. So any color you set, you can extract the RGB values from that color using that color picker there. So we're going to turn it to the green color. Then all we want to do is the edit mode back, text frame 2, we're going to change that text to the on. So we're turning it's currently off and we're going to change it to the on text. And also we're going to set the move increment to 1. I want to set that move increment to 1 because it is now off and we need to move that over. So however, what if it's off? Okay, so the reason we're going to set this to increment 1 and we're going to set B10 value to true. We're going to set the edit mode to true. Now let's take a look. If it's currently off, and I need to move it to the on. Where do I need to move this? I need to move this little ball to the right. So anytime we move to the right, it's an add. So we're adding to the left position. However, if we're moving it to the left, we're going to deduct from the left position, deduct, right? So it's a negative value. The larger the left value is, the more farther to the right it moves. The less the left value is, the more to the left it moves. So variable becomes -1, it's going to move to the left. If it's positive, it's going to move to the right. So when we're turning it off, I want to move it to the left. And so if we add this number, if we increase this number, it's going to keep moving and moving and moving within a loop. All we need to do to know which direction to move it in is set the move inquiry either to a positive or negative. Positive, it's going to move to the right. Negative, it's going to move to the left. And I'll show you that in this loop down here. So what if we turn it off? If we're turning it off, we're going to set that fill 4 color to 127, 125. And that's just simply the gray color that we've outlined here. Again, just taking a look in the shape format, setting that fill. You can set it to fill anything you want. Going to more colors, and you can see that gray, 127, 125, and 127. So that's where you can extract those colors from. Okay, so again, in this case, we're going to turn the edit mode back. We're going to turn the text to off. Here it was set to on. Here we're turning it off. And of course, we're setting the B10 value. We need to know this is going to be used for conditional formatting and a few other things. So we're going to turn that B10 to false, setting the edit mode to false. Okay, so we've changed the color, but we have not moved the shape. We haven't moved it left or the right. This is where it comes in. So we're going to turn off application screen updating, setting that to false. And we're going to set the button move from 1 to 29. So this is just the position. And that position really based on the size of this, the width of this. The larger the width, the greater the number is going to be 29, maybe 35 or 40. So you just kind of play with it to get the numbers right. It really depends on the size of the shape and the width of both shapes. So 20, it turned out to be 29, which is the right exact measurement after playing with it a little bit. And now what we want to do is we want to adjust the left position. So we're setting the left position. And the left position is going to be the edit of the current left position. What is the current left position? Plus the move incorporated. Now, if the move increment, I should say, if this move increment's a negative, of course, it's going to be moved more and more farther to the left. If it's a positive, it's going to be more and more farther to the right. So as the button as we go throughout it, each time it moves a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right based on the positive or negative of this. So that's all we have to do. And we just kind of loop through it. It happens very quickly. And once it's done, we're going to turn on application screen updating. And it happens very, very quickly. So we can see here, it just kind of gives it that move on and off. Okay, great. So we understand that, but how do we get this to hide and show based on that value? Well, that's conditional formatting. So if we take a look in the home and we conditional formatting and we manage rules, we see in this section we have several different rules. So we've got one for the highlighted row, we've got one for underlined, all based on E13 values. E13, basically the row is the starting position all the way down. And so that's going to give us we've got some dotted lines here. We only want to show up. However, when we want to hide everything, this particular rule is on top. Now, if this rule was moved down here and we clicked apply, it wouldn't work very well. When we turn it off, you're going to see we still have some conditional formatting. So notice that didn't really work. And so these are other conditional formattings that apply. And the reason it's not working is because we want that conditional formatting to take precedence. So when we highlight that and we go back into the home, conditional formatting, and manage those rules, we want to make sure that the B10 is false, meaning for that edit mode, that is on the very top. So we simply move it to the top position. We want this particular rule to take priority and precedence over all of the other rules. And that way, regardless of whatever the values in E13 or regardless of whatever the values are here, this rule, when it's turned off, is going to take precedence. So now we see once we've moved it back up to the top, we turn it off, everything disappears. And basically inside this rule here that we have, all we're going to be doing is changing the background color, removing the borders, and changing the font color. When we edit that rule, we can use the formula, B10 equals false. When that happens, I want three things to happen. I'm going to take the font color and I'm going to change it to the same color as the background. I'm going to take the border and I'm going to remove all borders. Simply using none here, I'm going to remove any and all borders around that. And I'm going to give it all a fill background color of the same as the background color. And that is how we basically hide regardless of whatever is there. It is conditional formatting that hides it, and it is VBA that will make sure nothing happens when this is false. Remember, making the selection change on here doesn't happen because edit mode is false. If edit mode is true, then something happens when we make the selection. So we can get a lot. So notice, now things happen, but only when edit mode is on true. Okay, great. So I'm glad I got to cover that for you. That's the conditional formatting. Let's go back inside here in the edit mode. Now we just have some rules that are going to help us moving on. Application event stop. This simply is going to turn off events, enabling events, turn calculation to manual, and screen updating to false. This is something you can use in almost every application, because when I run this inside a macro, it's going to turn everything off, making things a lot faster. As long as I do not exit the sub before running this, which is going to turn on enabling events, turn calculations to automatic, and screen updating to true. So make sure that anytime you run this or anything like this or any one of these statements inside a macro, that you must do the reverse before the macro ends, and you can't exit the sub out without doing that. Okay, so that's it for that macro. Now let's go into the invoice macros. The invoice macros where we're going to save, update, load. That is going to be it, along with the print macros. So we've got just a few others, not too many. And then let's go ahead and start up. We've got the invoice rows long, invoice item. We've got a long variables here. I'll go through them as we work through the application. And then what we want to do is we want the header shape as a shape, that head shape as a shape. Okay, so the invoice, with the invoice, what we're going to do, B3 is empty. I want to know when they save or updated invoice, what happens? Well, this is the button that's tied to that. It's the button and the icon. That's the macro. Now, this macro is going to say whether we're saving it as a new one or we're updating it. It is the same button that runs both. And it is that macro that we're going to be going over now. It's going to make sure to save everything, and it's going to run this little fade out message. You saw that little fade out message. That's going to come in. That's kind of a nice handy feature, so that it automatically fades out and then disappears, letting the user know it's kind of better than a message box, because the user doesn't have to take any action. So here's what I want to do. I want to determine first, is this a new invoice or not? If it's a new invoice, we see that that invoice row is going to be empty, located in B5. So we want to make sure we determine. Also, we need to make sure that the customer has been added properly. If B3 is empty, we know that there's no customer. If B3 takes on a number, we know a correct customer has been assigned. So we want to check for the things before we save it. If B3 is empty, please make sure to add a customer before saving the invoice. Again, remember this app event stop. We're stopping the app events. We're turning off screen updating. Calculation is going to set to manual, and screen and enabling events is going to be false. Okay, so we need to determine if it's a new or existing invoice. Very important. If B5 is empty, we know it's a new invoice. I just showed you that. What we want to do is determine the brand new row for that invoice. If you've watched my videos before, you've seen this a few different times, but going over it really helps us remember it, and it's going to allow you to create much faster applications by doing this type of repetition. So with the first available row inside the invoice list is going to be 9. We're going to assign that. We also want to assign the invoice ID in column A, and I want to know a few other things. So here's what we're going to do. The invoice row is going to be that first available row. We're going to set B4 to B4 is become whatever B6. Now, what is that? Inside the invoice, we know that our next invoice number, based on a max formula, the maximum of all the invoice IDs, plus 1. If there's no values at all, it'll return an error. Therefore, we're going to set the default to 1. That means the first invoice is going to be 1. What we're going to be doing is taking this next one and putting it directly in here, making sure that B4 contains that particular invoice number, so it's set up for the next one, so we know it's set. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to take that brand invoice number, and I want to put it directly in column A, and the row, that invoice row, is going to come whatever's into B4. So basically, we're just taking that brand new invoice number and putting it directly inside column A right here. Okay, but what if it's an existing invoice? If it's an existing invoice, all we need to do is extract the existing row from B5. We know there's a row, so B5. Everything else is simply going to take on, regardless if it is a new invoice or an existing invoice. And now what we've done here is we've lined things up pretty carefully here so that it matches the database. If we take a look at this invoice date, customer terms, status, due date, and footer message, take a look at that order here. I want to take these values here and I want to put them directly inside here. Invoice date, customer terms, status, due date, footer message. Other than total and total pages, everything kind of falls in line. So when we have that kind of mapping and matching, we don't need data mapping. All we need to do is just determine. So we know that invoice date's in column 2 here. We also know that invoice date here is in row 4. So if I take the row 4, minus 2 is going to get us the column. So we just need to loop from 4 to 9 and then subtract 2 from 2 all the way to here. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. For the field row, which is the long variable, equals 4 to 9. This is going to help us map and save that data to our invoice list. So that invoice list, that invoice row, we've already know the invoice row because we've either extracted it from here or created a new one from here. What is the field row? The column of that is the field row minus 2. Remember, the field row here starts at 4. So our first one, invoice date, is in column 2. So we need to subtract 2. Customers in 3 here, and the customer is in row 5 here. So that's all we need to do is just subtract 2 to get to that column. And it's simply going to be equal to whatever's in E in the field row. So this is data mapping here. We're mapping the data, and we're using the relationship between the rows because it's in the same order. So when you set up your forms, if you do it well, you don't need to use data mapping. It can be very simple. There's only 2 other fields that aren't mapped, and that is going to be the total and the total pages. Now, if we remember correctly, I want to save that total, the invoice total, which is going to be right here in column H, and I want to extract that invoice total. But where is the invoice total that's located? That invoice total is located right here. So we have it right here, invoice total located in AD, right? If we have a particular invoice that contains amount, we will see that amount here. And we'll see now it's filled in amount. So at AD here, 21 is going to take on that invoice total. So all we need to do is say H in the invoice row simply equal to AD 21. That is the invoice total. I also want to know the total number of pages. And this is important because when I load that invoice back into the invoice, when I take it directly from here, I need to populate this total number of pages. And I need to populate this cell right here, the total number of pages. So likewise, when I'm saving it, I want to take whatever's located in B12 and I want to place it directly inside column I. And that's what we're going to do with this last line of code. Invoice list I and invoice row value equals B12, the total number of pages. Okay, again, before we end that macro, we want to make sure that we restart the events and the calculations, and of course screen updating all must go back. And also what I want to do is, this is kind of a cool trick. When I'm going to be doing some other things, like when I print or when I move to pages, I'm going to be saving this. So there are times when I want to save this invoice without actually, like let's say I print the invoice, I want to save it first. Let's say I add a page, I want to make sure that we save it. However, I don't want always this invoice saved message to come up, right? I only want it up when the user actually saves it, right? So again, we're going to run the same macro a few different times. We're going to run it maybe when we add a page, when we navigate, when we print, or we save as a PDF. So we're going to run it, but I only want this particular, otherwise it's too slow. In other words, if I'm printing, I don't want to watch this thing save, but I want this confirmation only when the user presses the save button. Here's the thing. How do we run the same macro without it? So within this macro, invoice save message, we want to run this. Now this is the fade out message, is this little macro here that fades out that shape. And it takes a while, but I only want to run it sometimes. What do I mean sometimes? I only want to run it when the actual user presses this button. Only when they press this button. If I want to run this macro, save message, in anything else, like when they print, let's say we're going to be printing the macros, maybe I want to run it here. So invoice save update, right? You see inside this print, we're going to save that. So how do I get that pop-up message, that fade out message, to only run when the user selects a specific button, even though it's the same macro? So here's how you do that. We check to see what was the button that called the macro. If I take this button here and I give it a very specific name, in fact, if I give the icon the same name and I give all in the same name, so here it is down here, here's that group, here's a group of shapes. If we take a look inside this group, we have that little green check mark icon. Then we have this little icon here, and we have the button itself. So it's made up of 3 components. Now, all 3 of these components have the name save button. Save button. Now, make sure that when you're trying to give shapes the same name, you use this panel to rename it. Because if we try to rename it from here, it's going to be a little bit harder, right? It won't let us, but it will let us, especially when it's the same name, right? When we're trying to do the same name, use this panel here, the selection pane panel, to rename it to the same name. So that means no matter what, whether I click on here or here or here, or any one of those 3 components, that macro is going to run. So what do I want to do? If I decide I'm going to run this macro, I want to make sure that the only time I run this is when the user actually clicked that button. So if the application caller equals save button, then run the save message. So only when. So that means if they click another button such as print and the save is inside that print macro, like it is here, inside this print macro, it's right here, but we're not, this button will not call that fade out message. So it's really important because I don't want that fade out message to appear. I only want it to appear when the user clicks the save button and not at any other time. So this ensures that we do this. If the application caller equals anything else. In other words, the user clicked any other button or anything else to run that macro, then this particular portion of the macro won't be running. And that's exactly what I want. Okay, so the save message is simply, we've been over this a few times before. All we're going to be doing is taking a particular shape. If we see this shape here, let's see, invoice save message, if it's somewhere around here. But this particular button that you saw when I click save, you see that this particular one, invoice save, if you take a look at that, you can see it. It's probably fading out. Can't quite see it now. Somewhere around here. So it's running, and that's going to fade out. Now that button is called Save Message, Invoice Save Message. It's the shape, and all we're going to be doing is running a loop from 1 to 100 and changing the transparency. It becomes fully transparent onto completely transparent, not transparent to fully transparent using a delay. So that's all we have there. Customers add or update. Now this is a really cool thing. When I click on here, now let's say I've got a button here. Now this button is going to be that customer add or update. If I right click here, clicking on inside macro, we see customer add or update. To do this, what I want to do is I want to do two things. One, if they click it and there's a customer here, I want to edit that customer. However, if there's no customer here, I'm assuming that they're going to be adding a customer. So I want it blank. And this gives them the ability to add a new customer, Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens. Okay, so we're adding Ted Stevens. Now I want this customer added, save it. So basically we can either edit a customer and now it's been added to the list. I know that if they've selected a specific customer to edit that customer and load it. So this macro is going to take care of that for us. So here's what we do. We're going to mention the customer row is long and the customer column is long. The customer field as a control. Now we're going to use a user form on here. If we take a look at this, it's coming directly from this user form. And you may have seen this in my videos. We're using the same form as we do often. It's very, very easy. And this is called the add customer form. And basically all I want to do is loop through these fields here and load up whatever is located inside our customer files here. So basically I want to populate that user form with whatever is located right here, assuming that there's a given row of the customer. If there's no row, it is the new customer. So we just need to differentiate and determine whether it is a new customer or not. So first thing we want to do is clear the user form using unload add customer form. This will clear it out. If it's an existing customer selected, load those customer details. How do we know if it's an existing customer? Well, we know because we see that this customer row there's a row here. Oops, wrong one. If we delete this, we see that customer row in B3 is empty. So that's how we know. B3 is going to tell us whether we have an existing customer or not. So if invoice B3 does not equal empty, then we know it's an existing customer. Else it's a new customer. Okay, so if it's an existing customer, I want to load all the values up. So first of all, we're going to determine that customer row, and I want to populate that user form with all the customer details. So we're going to extract the customer row from B3, put it into a variable, and now we're going to run a loop from 2 through 8. Why 2 through 8? Because these are the columns associated. This is column 2, this is column 8. So we're going to run a loop inside that, and we're going to populate all of equals column, right? Column. Okay, so we're going to populate that from 2 to 8, taking all those values. Customer ID is not important. That's just an automated hidden item. So we're going to add this to our user form, and we're going to do it through data mapping in a particular loop. So we can do that through customer 2 to 8. Here's the loop. Now, how do we get away with doing that? Well, the way we can do it is by giving these very generic names. These field, this is called field 1. Here, this one is called field 2, and so on all the way to field 7. So by giving these field generic names, we can then map the data according to the columns. So we do that through this type of code here. Let's close that out. And we can see we're going to set the customer field, which is a control. It's part of the form. Customer field to add customer form. Here's the form we're focused on. Controls and the field and the customer column -1. Why? Now we know our customer column starts at 2. But our fields start at 1. They go through 1 through 7. So we need to subtract 1. So this is going to map that particular data. So we're going to set the customer field, setting that field. Then all we need to do is update the value. The value in this user form field is simply equal to the customers, the customer row, and the customer column. We're going to map data from customers into user form. And it's going to load that just through this little loop. And this is a great way, especially if you have a lot of fields, to automatically and quickly map. So that's going to add it in. Now, of course, if B3 is empty, it's a new customer, we are not going to populate the form fields with anything. The last thing is we are going to show the customer form. So what about when we save it? Now, if we take a look inside this, the customer form, and we view the code, we've got a little bit of code on save. There's two buttons on this user form. As we saw, let's pull that up here. There's two buttons. There's save and there's cancel. Save and cancel. If cancel, we're simply going to close it. If we click save, I want to make sure that we save any changes to this. So if I change this to any town, I want to make sure that that gets saved accordingly. So the next time we pull it up, it is that any town that shows up in the city. How do we do that? Well, that's through the save button. So when I make a click on the cancel button, we're simply going to hide the form. If I click on the save button, we are then going to save it. So here's what we need to do. Now keep in mind that we don't know if it's a new customer or if it's an existing customer. Well, we do know, but based on B3. So that means if we're adding a new customer, B3 is going to be empty. We need to add a brand new customer. So what we'll do is need to determine a brand new customer ID and populate all the fields here. To do that, we can do the following. First of all, I want to make sure that there is a customer name. Customer row is long, customer column. If ME, which means the form, this is the form, field 1, that's the customer name value equals empty, then please make sure to save a customer name before saving. We're going to make sure that that customer name is required. Then we're going to focus on the customer field. And then basically what I need to do is I need to determine is it a new customer or an existing customer. And as mentioned before, if B3 is empty, we know it is a new customer. If it is a new customer, we must first get a customer ID and determine the customer row, new customer. So to get that customer row, we're going to determine that customer row is going to be the first available row based on the customer sheet A and column and XLUP row 1. That's the first available row. Now what I want to do is I want to determine the customer ID. What is that customer ID? Now we've used it in formulas here. If we take a look inside here, invoice here, we can use something similar to this. See here we have the next invoice number. We're using the max, right? But what if I wanted to do something like this, but inside VBA? We can do it just like this. So the customer row is simply equal to, here's A in the customer row, application, worksheet function, max, using that same max formula, all the existing customer IDs plus 1, and that's going to be the next customer ID. Okay, but what if it's empty? Why would this be empty, or why would it create an error? If there's no data at all, that means there's a max of nothing, right? That would create an error. Therefore, we've wrapped it in on error resume next and on error go to 0. And if it is still blank, if A is still blank, that means it's probably the first customer in your list. If it's empty, then all we're going to do is simply set the default to 1. A and the customer row value equals 1 on the first customer. And it's exactly the same thing we did here inside this as far as the next IDs. So if we see that next ID, we say if there's an error, set the default to 1. Otherwise, use the max plus 1. So here it is in a formula, and here it is in VBA form. They both do the same thing. I'm just demonstrating two different methods to do that. Now, if you weren't comfortable with the VBA, you could easily add that formula in here for the next customer, and then just extract that next customer ID located in B7. So you could easily do that. If you'd rather not use VBA, you can also use a formula to do that. No problem. Both work just fine. Okay, now we're going to run a loop with data mapping, just like we did to load it, but this time we are going to save it. So we're going to run the same loop from 2 to 8. But this time we're going to take whatever's in the user form and we're going to save it directly into the customer database. So again, we're going to set that customer field exactly as we said, ME meaning the form, controls the field in the customer column starting at 2 minus 1. So that means 1 is our first one. And this time we're going to save to the database. So with the customers here, cells, the customer row, the customer column, the value equals a customer field. So here we're simply saving whatever's in Userform to the database using a quick data mapping loop. And then we're going to hide the customer form. We're going to I want to set the default, whatever the user has changed inside the customer name, whatever the customer name is in field 1, I want to place that directly inside E5. And we saw that when we added that brand new customer, that last customer, Ted Stephen, we saw after we saved that form, that name appeared directly inside E5. And that's what it was, that last line of code. Okay, great. So that is how we add customers through our user form. Relatively simple on that. Add and update customers. Now we're going to focus on invoice new. When we add a new invoice, what do we need to do? Well, of course, we want to clear out all the fields. That's certainly important. I want to clear out all the fields associated. I want to make sure that this invoice number here is also cleared out. I also want to take any defaults. I want to set the new invoice to unpaid. I want to set it to due on receipt or whatever the defaults are to here. So we've got to do that along with clearing out all the fields. So we're going to do that in this field. With the invoice B1, we're going to set the true. I want to set that invoice load true because we're making some changes to the invoice and I don't want anything else to run. Of course, before we finish, we're going to set it back to false here. So the first thing is we're going to clear out a whole bunch of associated cells, select the row, F2, E4, all the invoice fields, clearing the contents of all those fields. I also want to set default the next invoice. So whatever's located in B6, that next invoice number, I want to place that directly inside B4. I want to set the current date to E4, setting up that current date. So when we click new invoice, I want to make sure that current date is set there. I want to set the terms to the default terms, the status to the default status. And if there's a calculated, whatever the calculated due date is going to automatically appear. E4 is going to take on that date. B11 and B12 are going to take on 1. That's the selected pages and total pages, meaning the selected pages is going to go back to 1. The total pages is going to be to 1. That's going to be set the defaults for that brand new invoice. Then all we want to do is set B1 to false. And then I want to set the terms. Now I want to set those defaults. I want to take whatever the term is, that default term. So inside the admin screen, and when we look at terms, I want to look inside J6 through J11. I want to find that character 252, that checkbox. If it's found, I want to extract the row, and whatever's on that row, I want to place whatever's H in on that row. And that's exactly what we're going to do inside this VBA. However, if it's not found, it could create an error, and therefore we've wrapped it in on error resume next and on error go to 0. So that term row is simply this. We're looking for that character 252. We're looking from J6 through J11. That character 252 is what we're looking for. We're going to look in values and whole, and we're going to extract that row, and that is the term payment term row, default payment term row. Default. So if it is found, we'll then place it. So we can do, if the term row does not equal 0, that means it was found. We're going to place in E6 whatever's in H and the term row. So we're simply taking whatever's in H and the term row, whether if we set it to default 15, when we click new invoice, we want to make sure that E6 contains that default. Okay, next up, we're going to do exactly the same thing for status. Again, wrapping it in on error resume next and on error go to 0 in case it's not found. We're going to look for that check mark, but this time we're looking at F6 through F12. We're going to get the values and whole and extract the row. And this is going to be that default status row. So I want to place that default status row. I want to look for it. We're looking for it directly inside F6 through F11. If it's found, we're going to return the row, whatever's in E, and we're going to place that. So looking inside, we're extracting that from that default E, and we're placing it directly into E7 as long as it doesn't equal 0. And E5 select, we're just selecting something else. That is it for invoice new. How about when we load the invoice? Now, the loading the invoice is going to be in two parts. One, we're loading the invoice basic details, and next up, we're going to load the page. So it's going to be two different macros. Now, we split these. If you followed any of my videos before, generally invoice load is one macro where we load all of the invoice details, right, such as the invoice date, the customer, and all that stuff. However, in this case, I want to separate because we're going to load the page because page loads will be here. We're already on the first page of this one. So page load is going to be in a separate macro because I want to run page load in different instances. So in this instance, we're going to run page load. So I want to separate them. So let's do that. So the idea is to determine what row is the invoice and load up all of this information on here. So we're just simply going to load it all on. And we can do that as long as we have an invoice row. So we certainly need to make sure that B5 contains a value. So that's the first thing we're going to check. If B5 equals empty, then please enter a correct invoice row. As long as we have an accurate invoice row, we can continue. We're going to turn off screen application, updating calculations manual through this macro. We're going to set the invoice row inside a variable from B5. I want to set the invoice load to true, and we'll be turning it to false here. But what we want to do is also clear the contents. I want to make sure that any invoice data that was there before was not, but I certainly want to make sure that we're not going to clear whatever's located in B4. I want not to clear that. That's going to remain. Everything else is going to get cleared. We're going to set that default page load first, right? When I first load an invoice, I want to make sure that is that first page that's going to be loaded in. So we're going to set B11 to 1, right? Anytime an invoice gets loaded, we're going to set the page 1. Okay, then again, we're going to use data mapping just as we did before, but this time in reverse. Field row equals 4 to 9, 4 to 9. So E in the field row, 4 to 9, remember it's right here, 4 to 9 is simply going to be loading up whatever is located in the invoice list all the way from invoice date all the way to the footer message, and then separately the total and the total number of pages, just as we did the opposite. Okay, so the invoice list, the invoice row, field row -2, and the reason our column starts at 2, Our field row starts at 4, so therefore we need to deduct 2 to get to that. And that's going to fill in the invoice details. Invoice, all those 6 details right here. Next up is the last one right here. So I want to set the total number of pages. That total number of pages is going to go into B12. It's coming from I. So whatever's in I is going to go directly inside here, the total number of pages into B12. Okay, once we have that, we're going to run the macro to load the page, right? I want to load everything that's on page 1. That's this macro down here. We're setting B1 after that to false, and then we're going to turn on application screen updating and all that. Okay, now we're going to load the page. So what do I want to do? When I load the page, I want to look to see what page number is here. And I also want to look to see what invoice. And I want to load only those items on the associated page. Now, if we remember here in our invoice items, I want to do 2 things. I want to load all the items associated with this invoice and on a specific page. Now, if we remember our invoice ID, our criteria is located linked to B4 in the invoice. Our page number is linked to B11. So we can use this as criteria. Anytime this page number changes in B11, that criteria is going to automatically change inside our invoice item. And what that's going to do is we're going to run an advanced filter here. And we're going to return only those items on page 3. If I were to change it, go back to invoice and I go to the previous on page 2, it's only going to load those items on page 2. So now the criteria has changed, and now the items from page 2 we're going to load up here. Okay, so that's basically what we want to do inside that. So the first thing we want to do is check to make sure that B5 contains a value, right? If there's no invoice row, we can exit the sub. Also, B1, value equals true, setting the invoice load to true once again. Clearing the contents of the page item. This time we're going to only clear the page number. I don't want to clear any invoice data. I only want to clear all the way from J10 all the way through P and then also in column Q, but we certainly don't want to upset the totals. So I want to keep those formulas there. So we're going to go J through N and then another, J through N and then another one P through Q in 2 lines. So we do J through N here and P through Q here, clearing the contents of the existing page items. We're going to focus on the invoice item sheet. We're going to determine the last row. That's important for our advanced filter. If the last row is less than 4, that means we have no items. And we can skip all this and go to no items, right? So we don't need that. All right, continue. It's going to skip right here. Once we have the items, we're going to run our advanced filter starting in A3 going all the way to column K inside our invoice. Our criteria is going to be M2 through N3, and our results are going to come from P3 through P2 through W2. So that's where we're going to have our results and our criteria here. This is unique. We're going to run that advanced filter. We're going to determine the last results row based on column P. If the last results row is less than 3, going to no items, meaning that means if we have results but there's nothing in those results, last results row is less than 3, we know there's no results. There's nothing to bring over into the invoice. If we do have materials, if the last row in this case is 8, we know we're going to bring all these details into that. So we can bring that over. So basically I want to bring it over into 2 steps. I want to bring all the way from the amount. We're going to skip the total, and then the tax and the row are going to bring over into 2 lines of code. The results row, but it's really based on the invoice row. So I need to match, I need to know the invoice row is 10, bring that over. 11, 12. So we're going to base it on this invoice row because I want to make sure that these items get brought back into the same row of the invoice as they started, 10, 11, 12, 11, 12, 13, and so on and so forth. Okay, so to do that, we're going to run a loop for the result row equals 3 to the last results row. We're going to set that invoice item row variable to whatever's in P. That's where our invoice is. We need to know exactly where it's going into, and that's inside P. Once we have that in a variable, I can then take those items. J through N is simply going to equal Q through U. Bringing that up, so J through N is going to equal Q through U. The date, item, description, quantity, amount going to be brought directly over into the invoice. Here, date, item, description, quantity, amount. We're skipping the total. The next line is going to go P through Q, and bringing in those dates. Okay, so we don't need to debug that. We know we could probably do, let's add this. So when you select more than 2, we can just do on air resume next. Okay, that'll cover that. We don't need to deal with that. Right? So now when I select just 2, then you can see it's not going to have that issue again. Okay, so continuing on, we know that we're going to bring those items over. And in the second line of code, we're bringing in the tax and the row. I need to know that database row. That's very important because I want to make sure that we have that. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's going to be that second line of code directly inside here, P through Q is simply equal to V through W. So that's going to bring in the tax and the database row. And normally that database row is hidden. Again, to hide these things, all we need to do is highlight these here because I do want them hidden. I don't want them show. We're going to set the conditional formatting on that. Excuse me, the formatting on that. More number formats. We could use conditional formatting, but in this case, we're going to use formatting. Custom. And we're going to just use custom. Here, we're going to, instead of general, we're going to put 2 semicolons. And that's going to hide them. If it was text and numbers, we would use 3 semicolons. So clicking OK, it's going to hide them. And they're still here. If I click the cell, we see it's still here. It's just hidden from view, which is kind of a nice. So that's all we have to do. And we're going to set B1 to false, set that invoice load to false. That's all you need to do for the page load. It's very, very simple, right? Page load. Now what we want to do is I want to do previous and next page. If we take a look at this particular triangle here, that macro that's set is called previous page. If we click assign macro, we see previous page. And likewise, this one's next page. So inside those macros, what do I really have to do? Well, I have to look, first of all, if we're on page 1 and the user clicks it, I need to let the user know that they're on the first page. If they're not on the first page, what I want to do, I want to reduce this page number by 1 and then run that page load again. And likewise, if we're doing next page and they're on the last page, let them know that they are on the last page. So we just need to know that. These macros are relatively simple. So previous page, first of all, if B11 equals 1, we know we're on the first page. We can exit the sub. If they're not, then we're simply going to take B11. It's going to be B11 minus 1. We're going to increment the page down 1 and then run that again. It's such a simple macro to do that previous page. All we need to reduce is the macro that just reduces that page number down by 1 and then runs the page load. That's why having this separate macro not on the invoice load is very important. So having the page load separately, very, very important. Next page, almost exactly the same, except we're going to check to make sure, see if it's the last. How do we know if we're on the last page? Simply because the page number, that selected page number here, is the same as the total pages. If I know that, then I know that we're on the last page and we're going to let the user know. If not, we're simply going to take whatever's in B11, we're going to add one and we're going to replace it in B11. Then we're going to load the pages. How about a new page? Well, the new page is relatively simple. When I click add page, what I want to do is I want to clear the existing page and I want to also increase this by total pages. And I probably want to save, again, running the macro that's going to save it to ensure that this particular page gets automatically saved inside. So we see that invoice number 1, if we go into the invoice list, we see that there's total pages. Again, we're running that save macro. I'm saving this updating without having that fade out message. So here it is again, inside this invoice new page. So the first thing we're going to do is run the invoice save update, that macro that saves it. But you notice there's no fade out message when we do that. And that is because it is not the save button. It's not the macro that called it is not called save button. It's called something else. It's called rectangle round. So you see it's different. We know we're not going to run it. So the first thing we want to do is I want to save and update that. The next thing I want to do, that means if there's any changes, the next thing I want to do is increase whatever's in B11 is going to equal B12 plus 1. What does that mean? Well, if the last page is 5, I want to set the selected page to whatever's one above it. So if I click add page, I want to take the selected page and I also want to equal the total pages. So this one's going to be to the next value and this one's going to be to that brand new page number. So we're setting that up. So both of them are B12 plus 1. B12 equals B12 plus 1. B11 equals B12 plus 1. So this is going to, let's put a comma here, set selected page to the new page. And then this is going to increment the new page, increment page to plus 1. Okay, so we're simply adding the page. Okay, then again, we're going to load the page. This macro simply just clears it out and skips it, right? So because there's nothing on that page, running this, we can easily just clear the contents out, but running this macro is going to ensure that there's nothing on that. And then again, we're going to do one more. I want to save it one more time. And the reason is I want to make sure that we are saving B12, that new value of B12. I want to know to make sure that the total number of pages gets saved inside the database right here under total pages. So I want to make sure that gets saved as well. And that's exactly why we add that new page. Okay, now we got invoice navigation. If we're on invoice number 1 here, which I believe we're on a new invoice here. Okay, so we're on invoice number 1. And if I try to navigate previous, it's going to let me know that we're on the first invoice. If I try to go to next, it's going to go to invoice number 2. So I want to show you how we create these. And then if we're on the last invoice, which is 6, you're on the last invoice. So those are going to be the previous and next. So previous invoice and then next invoice. So first of all, I want to know the minimum number of invoices invoices. So I'm going to take a look. I want to know, if I'm going to previous, what is the lowest value on all of these? We're going to need that. And I also want to know to make sure that we have that is a value there. So we're going to wrap it in on error, resume next, and on error, go to zero. We're going to use the min function, the minimum function, for the minimum invoice number. It's going to be the application worksheet run min of all this range invoice IDs. I want to know the lowest value. What is the lowest value? Then what I want to know is if the minimum number equals 0, then there hasn't been any invoices created. We're going to let the user know to please create to save an invoice first. That means there's no invoice in the database, and we are going to exit the sub. We're going to set the invoice number equal to B4. And now what I want to know is, that's the current value, that's the current invoice number. I want to know what the current one is, B4 here. Here's the current invoice number. Okay, so we're setting that to the current invoice number. And the first thing I want to know is, what if they're on a new invoice? So we have to decide, if there's no current invoice, let's say we're on new invoice, and they click preview, what should happen? Well, I'm kind of thinking that the last invoice created should happen. So the previous invoice is 6. So what I want to do is I want to load number 6. If there's no invoice here, previous is going to load invoice number 6. So to do that, I want to check if the invoice number is 0 or B5 value equals empty, they're on a new invoice. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to set the invoice row to the last one available. What is the last one? I'm going to look inside this here. I want to know the last one created, which is this B, which is on row 8, and it's invoice 6. So that's the last one. That's what I want to happen, and that's what I'll load. So I'm going to set that invoice row to 8 because that's where the last one was found. Else, what about an existing one? The existing one, I want to find it. Let's say they are on, and the reason we can't go just -1 and -1, what if I delete invoice number 3 and it skips from 4 to 2? So I can't just go invoice, I can't just assume that 3 is going to exist. So I want to know what's on the row below it, because there might not be a 3. So I want to determine what's the row of the current one. If we're on current invoice number 4, what is the one below that? It may not be 3. So I want to know what the row below it. In this, if we've deleted 3, it would be 2. Okay. So I want to know the row that's associated. To do that, I want to know what the existing row is. So the invoice list range ID, I want to know the current invoice number. I want to know what row is on. What row is the current invoice number on? We can also use this value here too. We know that the current invoice row is 8. I want to know what we could determine basically B5 -1. That would just work as well. Or we could take this, using this, the find, and determining the row and -1. So we could take the current invoice row and subtract 1. We could also just use the value that's located directly inside of B5. Either one work, but it's just a different way to show it. Okay, so now that we know that the invoice row of the one we want to show, all we need to do is just determine it. If B6 equals 1, I want to make sure, what do you mean B6 equals 1? If we take a look at this, the next invoice, if the next invoice is 1, then we know they haven't have any data yet. Or the minimum number is 0, or the minimum invoice number is B4, then we're on the first invoice. So all of those conditions mean that they're already on the first invoice, they can't move off. However, if none of those conditions are accurate, we simply need to take B4, take the ID and put it into B4. So what I'm going to do is, I already know the row. I've already determined the row that it's on. So whatever is in A and that row, I'm going to take it, which is the invoice ID, I'm going to take it and I'm going to place it directly inside B4. Once I put it in B4 and then I run the macro that's going to load, it's going to load the associated invoice. And that's all we need to do. Take that, place the invoice ID, place invoice ID inside cell. Okay, once it's placed there, we run this macro, it's going to load the invoice accordingly. Next, invoice is relatively simple, except we're going to use the max this time. We're using the max. So the maximum invoice number is the application worksheet function. Again, we could also use the max formula here, -1. We've got it here, the next invoice number, -1. Or we could simply do it through a formula, a function here, using the function max invoice. So the invoice ID, I want to know the highest number. What is the highest number in the list? Now I also want to know what the current invoice number is. What is the current invoice number? If the max invoice number is 0, it means they have not saved any invoices yet. And we're going to let them know to please create and save the invoice first. Okay, so if the invoice number, if the one they're currently on, equals the max one, then we know we're on the last invoice, right? In this case, We're on 6. Look, if we're looking on 6, we see that the maximum number of this is 6. We've already calculated the maximum of 6. And if we look at the current one, we know the current one is 6. So we know if I try to hit next, we know that we're on the last invoice. So that would invoke that pop-up. However, I also want to check if the invoice number is 0 or B5 equals empty, we're on a new invoice. Again, if we are on a new invoice, what do I want to happen? Well, if I click next, then we'll just default to the first invoice that was created. So that might work too. I wouldn't know what else to put there unless you want to put the last. It's kind of up to you in discretion. What do you want to put when they click next and there's no invoice available because there's nothing there? Okay, so the invoice row, we're going to set it to 3. So basically I'm defaulting to the first invoice created. On an empty invoice, go to first one created. Else is put in the next one, right? So we know if I know that it's not the last one, and we're currently on 6, row 6, whatever's in row 7, whatever's in A and row 7, we're going to put that's going to be the next one. So that's all we're going to do. The invoice row is simply equal to where your current one has been found, whatever row, plus 1. So this is going to help us in case we've deleted. We just know what's in the next row below that. We're going to place that's the invoice row. Once I know the invoice row, whether it's 3 or whether it's calculated down 1, we're simply going to take whatever's in A, that ID of that row, and place it directly into B4 and then run the macro to load the invoice. Last one is invoice delete. Before we get to the print, invoice delete. How do we delete an invoice? Now this is important. So what I want to do when I delete an invoice is obviously I'm going to determine what row is in here and delete the row that's associated. I also want to determine all the items that are associated with a particular invoice regardless of page. So we're going to run advanced filter only on the invoice ID because I want to know all the items. It doesn't matter what page, right? In any page. And then I want to delete those. But to delete them, what I want to do is I want to sort them based on the row. I want the highest row here first. So in this case, this would be reversed. It would be 38 at the top and 4 at the bottom. And then I would basically loop through these rows starting at 38 all the way down to 4, determining what row in the database, deleting that row, and moving down, down, down. So that's how we're going to do it here. So we're going to do exactly that. First of all, we're going to say, are you sure you want to delete this invoice? Yes, no, delete invoice, and exit the sub, just giving them a way out in case. We're going to turn off application screen updating and events and all that. We're going to determine, has it been saved or not? Because if it's a new invoice, it's very easy. If it's a new invoice and they decide to delete it and we say yes, we're just going to skip all that and go back to new invoice. However, if it's an existing invoice, there's a few things that we want to do. If B5 is value, that means it is an existing invoice. So I'm going to put that row inside a variable. And the first thing we want to do is delete that directly from the database. Invoice row on the invoice list, and delete that invoice row. That deletes the basic invoice details, but it does not delete the items. So now we must run some code that actually deletes those items. And to do that, we can do with the invoice items. So the last row of that items, we're going to run an advanced filter, A99 and XL row. All right, if the last row is less than 3, then go to not saved. Okay, if you like the features here, but you have an idea of something that I haven't covered and you want to get your feature added into this training, you can do that through our Patreon platform. In fact, we've got this something called a feature, fix, or focus, where I'll add a feature, or I'll fix something that's broken, or I'll focus on something else. Every single time I do a training, I do an updated version on our Patreon platform. And it starts out at just $3 a month, and it's a great way to help us out. So if you do get a chance, join us on Patreon. I'm creating new training, and there's a whole lot of other features, including PDF downloads, icons and pictures, or whatever goes, other resources with these trainings. So I hope you'll join us there. So we know if the last row is less than 3, then it's not been saved. We can go to not save. We can skip all that because there is no invoice items for a specific invoice. If there are items, I want to run an advanced filter based on our invoice items, just as I had mentioned to you. Running that advanced filter from A3 through K, this time using criteria only on that invoice ID and not the page. So our criteria is going to be M2 through M3, and having those results come from P to W. And that's just what we're going to do here. A3 through K. Our range criterion is going to be M2 through M3, just the invoice ID, and having the results come here. We're going to determine the last results row. If the last results are less than 3, that means there are no results, there are no items for an invoice, and we can skip it. If our last results row are less than 4, that means we have only one item on the invoice. If there's only one item, we don't need to sort anything. We can just skip the sorting. However, if there's more than one item, I want to then sort it from the highest down to the lowest, descending, running a sort. So we're going to focus on the sort. First thing I want to do is clear the sort fields. I want to add a key. It's going to be W3. That key is very important right here because it's going to be, that's the number, the row number that we're going to be sorting. And we're going to be sorting it descending from the highest to the lowest. Our range is going to be from P3 through W in the last results row. That sets the range all the way from P3 all the way through W and down here. That's the area that I want to be sorted. And the last thing is we're simply going to apply that sort. Once it's sorted, we're going to run a loop. The result row equals 3 to the last results row. I need to know that database row. I need to put that into a variable invoice item database row located in column W. So that's going to be here, the invoice item database row. Then I'm ready to delete that item directly inside our invoice items. Our invoice item sheets here. We're simply deleting that row and we're going to loop through all of that. Lastly, once we get through that loop, we're simply going to run the macro, the invoice new. That's going to clear out all the fields, and we're going to turn on application screen updating. Okay, that's it for the invoice macros, and the print macros, relatively simple on the print. Now, the print is, when we're printing it, we need to make sure that, let's pull up invoice number 1. When I'm making a print, I want to make sure, you want to see what delete, all right, I'll delete them just so you can see that in action. Okay, so we got an invoice list here, 6. We've got invoice items here. Let's just take a look. I want to run that macro. So we've got several items for 6, you see. So what I want to do when I invoice that and I delete that, I want to say yes, and it's going to delete that, clearing out. So we see that we do not have 6 anymore. We go into the invoice items, we see that 6 has been removed. Back on print, when I want to print, what I want to do, let's pull up a multi-page invoice. Not only do I want to print what's here, but I want to loop through all the pages. I've got 6 pages. I want to loop through all of those pages here to make sure that we print every single page. And to do that, we're just going to run a little bit of a loop. So we need to determine the last page. So the invoice, first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a save. Here's another instance where we're saving it, but we do not want that fade out message to appear, that shape. I'm going to determine the last page is going to be on B12. I'm going to run a loop from the page number equals 1 to the last page. We're going to put that page number directly into B11. And here's another instance where we want to load only the page, loading that page, running the macro, and then simply going to print it out. It's that simple to print multi-page invoice. So if I decide I'm going to print it, I'm going to click print the invoice. Okay, and it's going to basically run the loop. It's going to print each one to my default printer, starting from page 1. It's going to loop through, and here's my Snagit in my printer. You see each page individually is being printed out, and it's all relatively quickly. And so we take a look inside and now it's done. Okay, so we have some blank pages here, but that's it. It's relatively simple. And we see here we've got page 6, page 5, page 2 of 6, page, let's go from page 6 of 6, page 1 of 6. So we've got all the pages here. All right, here we go. Page 6 of 6, the last one I printed out. And this is 5 and 4 and 3. So they're all, you can see down here, they're all printed out properly. Okay, very, very cool. Now, save as PDF is going to be a little bit tricky. I'm going to cover that on our Patreon platform. Why is it tricky? Because I want them all, now certainly I could print you several different PDFs and that would be easy, but I want to actually put it all into single PDF. And I'm going to show you that on our Patreon platform. Hopefully I'll get that to work really nicely. Make sure you sign up for our Patreon platform to see how that happens. Okay, please join our Patreon program to see how we create those amazing PDFs in a single PDF. If there's anything else you want to see in this application, please let me know. I would love to bring that to you on our Patreon. Also, we've been over so much. We've learned a lot in this training. We learned how to create a really fully customizable invoice, multi-page invoice, where we can customize every single aspect of this particular invoice in a beautiful format and fully functional that anybody can use with or without edit mode. Okay, we show you that with shapes, multi-page, of course, how to save, update, print pages, load them, and a whole lot more. Thank you so much for joining me on this training. If you like these trainings, you want to help support us, grab the 250 workbook pack, 250 templates of my best templates, and it's a very low price. I'll include the details below. Thank you so much for your likes, comments, shares, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.